Since 2007, human feet have washed ashore along the eerie coastlines of the Salish Sea. With no signs of struggle and no clear pattern, the discovery sparked wild theories. As more feet continue to appear, the sea keeps its secrets and the mystery deepens. Hear more about this over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, all linked down below. My name is Joseph, and I'm from Austria. Many years ago, I went on a long-awaited dream holiday to Paris, France. I had always wanted to see the Eiffel Tower, walk along the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honore, explore the catacombs, and visit Notre Dame Cathedral. It's such a tragedy what happened to that. But I finally saved up enough money to take the time off from my job as a chef and surprise my girl with a trip to the City of Love. We drove there from our home country of Austria and had a nice road trip on the way, staying at various locations and making many happy memories. Then we reached Gay Paris. It really was the most romantic city. We dined under the shadow of the Eiffel Tower and the twinkling city lights. We took long walks along the Seine and made love in our hotel room with the windows open to the late-night city. Apologies if this is not appropriate to share, but we Europeans are just sort of a free people who are not ashamed of our love for beautiful women. It was perhaps our fourth day in Paris, when myself and my lover Amelia were seated in a cafe awaiting our latest delectable taste of French cuisine. I had parked our car on the street outside. There was a parking space next to it, and I thought nothing of it, as the average car would be able to fit in there. A man came driving along and idled beside the space. The movement caught my eye and I watched him with some curiosity, as I am always interested to see how other people maneuver into parking spaces. I forget the brand of car that this man had, but it was clearly too big for him. He did not possess the necessary skill to navigate into the parking space. Instead of giving up and moving on, however, he began to use his vehicle to shunt the cars on either side of the space in order to widen the gap. My car included, of course. Shunting a parked car like that can shatter the steering column or the axles, and this absolute Oslok was going hog wild doing it to my car and that of the hapless stranger parked adjacent to me. Naturally, I rushed out of the cafe and into the street. I yelled at him, in German, forgetting myself for a moment, and he pulled his car to a stop, pushed against mine, and climbed out. This man was a burly, dirty-looking dock worker type who fit every stereotype of the rough and vulgar Frenchman that I'd ever seen growing up. Nothing like the actual people that I'd encountered in Paris thus far, I might add. I could tell that he didn't understand a word that I was saying to him in German, but my French is pretty merda, so I tried English. I told him that he would damage my car and the neighboring car and his own car too, and to stop being a dep and go and park somewhere else if he wasn't able to fit a stupid vehicle in the space. And the man called me a filthy Spanish pig, and then told me to go back to Spain. I raised an eyebrow at him and called him a slur that I probably shouldn't have said, a very rude word in Austrian that sounds a little like foot but means something very different. And this was a big mistake because apparently he understood enough to know what I was insulting him with. And this burly man almost leaped over the hood of his car and came running towards me. He jabbed one huge finger right into my chest, almost knocking me backwards as he did so. I really hoped that Amelia would stay in the cafe and not draw attention to the fact that she was with me. Now this road rage Frenchman began to yell at me, and spit was flying from his lips. Now in English, I asked him to politely back off, but instead, he grabbed me and pushed me up against the wall. He put one fist next to my head in a clearly threatening gesture and began screaming right into my face. In that moment, I understood why they become road rage incidents, because I felt the anger burning inside me too. How dare this boorish man yell at me and get spit in my face? I was a visitor to his city. Besides, he was the one who had repeatedly shunted that car like some moronic bull. So I said this to him, trying my best to seem angry and threatening, and then shoved him backwards to get him off of me. Now this was a huge mistake. The Frenchman barely budged and then sneered at me and started laughing. He drew his fist back, ready to clock me in the jaw. I ducked, and then he punched the granite wall behind me. Now, no sooner had he started to howl that I delivered a kick to his nether regions and ducked under his arm. Now, I probably should have kicked him harder because it did absolutely nothing to slow the enraged Frenchman driver down. He reached out to grab me, and I could see actual murder in his eyes. He was snarling and frothing like some kind of drunken animal, and I'm sure he was indeed plastered even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. My moment of confidence was over. I bolted, running from that angry driver down the street calling for help. Paris, which had once seemed such a romantic and wonderful place, now seemed hostile and uninviting to me. Passers-by looked on with just blank dismissal as I thundered down the sidewalk, my lumbering aggressor behind me. Thankfully, I was fitter, healthier, and smarter than him. I darted through a crowd, then across a courtyard, and eventually found myself looking at the Louvre Pyramid. An art gallery and museum seemed like the perfect place to lose a man such as this, so I darted past the glass structure, ducked into a building, and quickly found a public toilet. I hid in there and called Amelia on my cell and asked her to keep an eye out for the guy. She told me she was still in the cafe and that the police had been called, and the man's car was being clamped and towed. I stayed in the line with her as she described the next scene. The angry driver returned to his car and saw officers milling around the vehicle. I suppose in his drunken stupor, he mistook one of the officers for me and began to grab him, and then got forcibly thrown to the ground and subdued with batons. Amelia described it to me as I cowered in the bathroom, and I have never been more grateful in my life to miss out on something. The man and his car were carted away, and I have no idea what became of him, and I really don't care to know. Thankfully, our car was undamaged and we enjoyed the rest of our trip to Paris, but I have never trusted French drivers to park their cars properly to this day. A few years ago, I went on vacation from the States to Eastern Europe. Now, I don't want to say exactly which country I went to, because it was most definitely wonderful and I don't want to give it a bad name. I did a lot of traveling around the country, and while most of the places I visited were great, with awesome people and some pretty sick food, just an awesome time in general, there were a couple of joints that were absolutely seedy as hell. One of them was a town I'll just call Hellville. I stayed here for a week when I was backpacking, and I was meeting a female friend a week later and planned to spend a bunch of time with her. So for now, I was just kicking back and exploring this little town of Hellville that I found en route to her digs. I could tell that it was a sketchy place as soon as I hopped off the bus into town. It had a vibe kind of like Eli Roth's Hostel, and my dumb self found that pretty exciting. I'd joked the whole time before my vacation that I was going to stumble across some backwoods village where the locals kidnap tourists for the entertainment of rich sickos, and I was almost excited by the fact that this place looked like it had potential. Yes, I know that I was, and am, an idiot. The first night I got way too drunk in the local Hellville dive bar and almost got into a fight with a Chechnyan ex-military guy until we realized it was a big misunderstanding and ended up dancing and singing through the streets. Matthias became a good buddy then, and we exchanged cell phone numbers. He was backpacking through Europe too, and in our drunken stupor, we worked out that our routes would intersect a bunch more times, so we should look each other up. Feeling good for making a new friend, especially a badass Czech former soldier, I collapsed into bed in my hostel, being snapped at to shut the F up by more than one angry traveler. The next day, I went exploring Hellville. There wasn't really much to explore, just a few unhygienic-looking bars and cafes, a central square with an honest-to-God village well in it, which I was certain would give me cholera, and then a bunch of farmland. I took a stroll through the countryside to see if I could find any of those classic European milkmaids hard at work in the fields. Sadly not, but I did spy a few gruff-looking farmers and a group of teens in tracksuits that I didn't really like the look of. They were sitting on a fence, chattering in their language, and I could tell that they were talking about me because they were pointing at me and then whispering to each other and laughing. Despite being my arrogant self, I decided to make like a tree and split. I tried to look as casual as possible, but quickly broke into a jog. Now my heart sank as I heard footsteps and the sound of teenage voices behind me. A couple of them sprinted ahead to catch up with me and stood blocking my route back into town. There must have been 5 or 6 guys in total, 4 eventually facing me and then 2 big meatheads blocking off the return path. One of them pointed to my shoes and said something about trainers. I didn't understand for a moment, and then he muttered something about Nikes and then sneakers. I remembered Europeans referred to sneakers as trainers and then realized that he was saying that he liked my Nikes. I said back, yeah, that they were nice sneakers, but very cheap ones. Now this was true, they were probably only $100, nothing to get excited about. This caused the teens to start laughing cruelly, and then the obvious ringleader pointed at my shoes again and referenced that damn Daniel meme from years ago. I politely laughed and he began to shove me, saying something in his language that I didn't understand. I could tell from his body language that he was asking why I was laughing at him though, which I'm sorry, but I thought that that's what you're supposed to do when someone says a meme, even if it's an ancient dead one. I had no idea how to convey it to this guy though, who clearly just wanted to start trouble with me. His buddy, a fat pig-looking guy with a Michael Cera bum-fluff mustache, also pointed at my shoes and told me to take them off in some broken English. Now under no circumstances was I going to give these a-holes my sneakers. They might have been cheap Nikes, but they were mine, and they served me pretty well on my backpacking trip so far. I told them to F off, and then realized that this might not be a good idea when there were 6 of them and 1 of me. I turned to leave and realized that one of the bigger guys blocking my path was actually carrying a knife. Now, it was only a Swiss Army knife and looked rusty as hell, but I didn't really like my chances of survival if that thing went into my gut. I was surrounded on both sides, so I did the one thing they hadn't counted on. I leaped the fence to my right and began to sprint across the fields like I was back in high school track. These teens started yelling and shouting, and I heard a crash from behind me as they leaped and toppled over the fence. One of them, probably the fat kid, had fallen to the ground and tripped a couple of more of them up. I continued to sprint, glancing over my shoulder and saw that 3 of them were still following, including the leader and the one with the knife. Now this knife guy wasn't that fast, but the leader was leaping over ditches and all sorts of stuff and clearly knew the land better than I did, so he was gaining on me. I kept running, looking for help of some kind, any kind. Did they even have cops patrolling the streets here? I certainly hadn't seen any kind of law enforcement. Hell, I'd take a miserable-looking farmer at this point. Surely these teens wouldn't stab me to death for my sneakers in front of the villagers. I had no idea what the place might be like, though. My mind went back to how I'd joked about looking for a town like in the movie Hostel, and I cursed myself for being such an idiot. I wasn't even going to die in a cool way by having my eyes cut out or my wiener fed to dogs or anything. I was going to get murdered in the middle of some ass-backwards nowhere place just because these kids wanted my $100 sneakers. Hell no, I thought. I doubled my efforts and leaped across the fields, vaulting a fence or 2 in order to escape my pursuers. A stone whistled past my head, and then another, and I realized the teens had stopped to scoop up projectiles at some point, and I was now in serious danger of getting my skull cracked as well as a knife between my ribs probably. A voice in the back of my head told me that maybe I should just hand the sneakers over, but my ego wouldn't allow it. Instead, I managed to run to the village. The first place I thought to go was the local bar, and thank all that is holy, my ex-military pal Matthias was actually sitting at the bar, just nursing a Coca-Cola or something and chatting to the barkeep. Now I quickly ran up to him and told him that the kids were trying to kill me. He started laughing, patted me on the back, and said that he was sure that I could look after myself. And for some reason he thought that I meant little children were trying to kill me. And I frantically insisted that no, it was a gang of late teens, one of them had a knife, and they were also throwing rocks. And the door burst open, and the 3 pursuers came in. The bartender said something in her language that I could tell was probably derogatory, and the ringleader of these youths snapped something back. Matthias jumped to his feet, knocking a stool over, and stood towering over even the biggest of the 3 teens. In that moment, I saw F around and find out playing out in real time. Matthias reached around the back of his belt and produced a small bag, which I realized was some kind of military-looking club. He slapped it against his palm and stepped forward. The kids froze, unsure whether to size up to Matthias or run. In the end, the bartender made the decision for them. He stepped out from the back room, shotgun in hand, and pumped it and pointed it at them. The boys started frantically apologizing, and the barman yelled something that I later found out meant, "I'm going to tell your fathers and you'll be getting the beating of a lifetime." Matthias and the barman explained to me that American sneakers are a valuable commodity to the teenagers in that country, and I should probably wear older, crappier-looking shoes if I'm going to travel around there. And Matthias even promised to hook me up with a pair of his army boots, which later he did. Now, they were 3 sizes too big for me, but I wore them with pride and still own them to this day. That night, Matthias and the barman treated me to a few drinks, and Matthias regaled me with some tales from when he was in the military. And all I can say is that I'm glad he and I did not get into a fight the night before, and I'm almost happy for the teens that they backed down when they did. Man, Matthias can be scary at times, and I'm still in touch with him to this day via email sporadically. He travels Europe like some kind of Jack Reacher drifter, only without the wild adventures, but I like to think that if he needed to throw down, he would. Now, I moved on from Hellville the next day and went to visit my female friend early. I was not sad to be out of that village, and looking back, I cannot believe how dumb I was to fight for my life instead of just handing over those damn sneakers. But on the other hand, they were nice sneakers and I paid for them with my own money. No deranged European kids get to steal my shoes. Firstly, I want to begin this story by saying that I do think Egypt is a lovely country. It's populated by many wonderful people, and I have friends that are both immigrants and natives. I have visited the country again since the incident I'm going to tell you about, and I enjoyed my time there. Unfortunately, though, there's no avoiding the fact that attitudes to women in Egypt can be unpleasant. Things are a bit more relaxed in the country in 2025, but when this occurred in 2011, it could be extremely risky for a woman to walk around by herself, especially uncovered. A lot of Egyptian women wear hijabs or niqabs, covering their hair or almost everything apart from their eyes. Of course, Western non-Muslim women visiting Egypt just dress how they normally would, but this can be dangerous and downright stupid if you're alone. And as such, when I first visited Cairo, it was strongly advised that young women cover up as much as possible, make sure that they're with a male chaperone, and stick to the touristy areas. I was most excited about seeing the pyramids and exploring the deserts, and I wasn't even particularly thrilled about spending a few nights in central Cairo before we began our proper tour. Our tour guides insisted that it was totally worth it though, and we needed to experience the city to experience Egypt. As I followed the tour group through the bazaars, taking in the sights, the sounds, and the smells, I was starting to get won over. My dad was engaged in animated discussion with one of the guides, and they become fast friends. Mom just seemed happy to look at the rugs and ornaments for sale, and all the other middle-aged tourists were cooing and awing over the sights. I was the only young woman in her early 20s, and there was a guy my age on the tour group too, but he'd opted out of this afternoon's city tour due to food poisoning, which was really because he was hungover from the night before. Nobody was really paying attention to me, nor did I to them, which is why I didn't notice it first when I lost sight of the tour group. At first I didn't panic. They couldn't have gone far, but when I turned down the next alleyway and found myself in a crowd of unfamiliar Egyptian faces, it did cause me to pause. A few of the older male store owners were looking at me a little strangely, their eyes traveling up and down my body, even though I was wearing jeans and a long-sleeved t-shirt, the best compromise I could make in this heat. I got pulled along by the throng of the crowd, and before I knew it, I'd been kind of forced into another side of the alley, ducking out of the flow of people just so I could get my bearings. A few young men stood in a doorway, and I knew immediately that they were trouble. They sort of strutted over towards me in the way that certain guys do, and the way they studied my body made the previous store owners look reserved. They looked at me with a barely disguised hunger, and I swear to God, one of them even licked his lips. They started talking to each other in Arabic, and I couldn't understand what most of them had said, but recognized the word for cattle or cow and girl. One of them said something that caused the others to hoot and clap his buddy on the shoulders. I quickly apologized for disturbing them, which was a mistake. I shouldn't have acknowledged them or made eye contact. Before I could step back out of the alley, one of them grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me deeper into the shadows. My blood immediately ran cold. I knew exactly what they wanted to do to me and what the things that they were saying meant. One of them pinned my arms behind my back, while another one started to lift my t-shirt, running his fingers over my stomach. I felt sick and knew that this was it. If I didn't do something now, then this was going to be an event that would define the rest of my life, whether I wanted it to or not. I drew on all my self-defense training and slammed my body back into the guy holding my hands. He hit the wall with a thud, letting go of my wrists. Using the momentum, I kicked forwards at the guy who had been touching me, slamming his head backwards against the first guy's nose as I did so. I heard a crunch and a scream, and quickly pulled free as two of the guys howled in pain. The third guy had been watching, but he was the one that started to chase. I had no idea where I was running to or how I could find safety. There was every chance that I'd just run into more angry young men who were looking to tear me apart. I can't even describe the chase because it was all some blur. All I know is that the man chasing me grabbed my hair and shirt at least a few times, including one where he tore a chunk of the hair out of my scalp, causing me to cry out in pain. It felt like I'd never escaped him. Everywhere I went, crowds were surging forward, and it was only later that I learned that I was on the outskirts of a goddamn armed riot. And I think that's what saved me. Eventually, I burst into a courtyard and saw my parents and the tour group. They all looked frantic and defensive, and I guess that's why our one tour guide who'd befriended my dad was holding a brick. He barely paused as I came sprinting into the courtyard, followed by a guy who was clearly chasing me. The tour guide pulled back his arm and let his brick fly straight and true. I heard it hit my pursuer's head with a loud, hollow clunk, and he just sort of dropped to the floor like a discarded sack of potatoes. The tour guide said it was better that we got out of here because something was clearly going down, so he and the other guide led us down some more side streets and away from what he explained was turning into a full-scale riot. I asked if we should tell the cops about the guys who tried to assault me, and he just sort of laughed. We made it back to the hotel, which was gated and had armed guards. The next day, it was time for the tour group to move on anyway, and we spent the rest of the vacation at a luxury resort near the pyramids, where we lounged by the pool, relaxed, and went on various day trips to ancient historic sites of interest. Now, I love Egypt, and like I say, I've been back there since, but this was the most terrifying experience I've ever had, and one that could have changed my life, all because some people see others as less than human. This is a story I tell my buds for a laugh sometimes, but I only laugh about it because otherwise you'd bloody cry, you know? Everything turned out okay, but honestly at the time, I thought my entire life was over, and I'd spent the rest of my days rotting in a Dutch jail. So it all started because me and a mate, Milo, got really into mopeds. We both got mopeds while we were still in school. While the rest of our friends were learning to drive cars, we smugly declared that our little scooters were the most cost-effective, sensible option, and anyone who pissed all their money into the tank of a 4-seater gas guzzler was a right chump. After school, we graduated from just having our CBT, a learner's permit for mopeds, to actually passing our motorcycle tests. We were living large, riding our mopeds around town like a lame British Macklemore, that song he did about mopeds, downtown, which was unironically our theme song if you want to picture exactly the kind of insufferable twats that we were back then. Now one day, Milo excitedly showed me a video that he'd found online, advertising a group moped trip from Poland to the Netherlands. I didn't quite understand the deal at first, but as I watched the video, it seemed like we'd go on a cross-continent moped tour with the group as part of a documentary they were filming. Not only would we get to embark on the trip of a lifetime, but it would cost us almost nothing. As long as we could get ourselves there, we'd be provided with room, board, and moped rental every step of the way. I was a bit sad to have to leave my beloved Vespa behind in the UK, but as for the rest, you could not sniff at that at all. Milo was incredibly enthusiastic about it too, and looking back, I didn't really have the time to pause and wonder if there was some kind of catch. And by the time my girlfriend Jane suggested it seemed too good to be true, I was already fully on board and committed to the idea, so I didn't really want to find any excuses to back out of the trip. I didn't do my due diligence and look into Pete, the guy organizing the tour. Milo said that he had though, and everything was totally on level, so hey, why wouldn't I believe my childhood best friend? We flew to Poland a couple of months later, and honestly I'd be lying if I said that the trip wasn't great. It was our first time going on a foreign holiday and we really relished it. The moped journey from Poland to the Netherlands was great fun, even if it took some getting used to riding a different machine, and me, Milo, and the 3 other guys and Pete all got on really well. After some days of fun, frolics, and breakneck moped driving, we pulled into the parking lot of the hotel we were going to be staying at in the Netherlands. Immediately it was very obvious that this was a brothel, and I shot Milo a look. This is not what we'd agreed upon. Jane would certainly not be okay with me staying in a damn brothel. Luckily for Jane, she wouldn't have to worry about it. We parked up our mopeds outside, climbed off, and then suddenly, floodlights slammed on in the darkness, and loud voices were yelling. I didn't understand what was being said, but as a group of armed cops stormed into view, I understood the premise. Get down on the ground with your hands above your head. I complied, but I was almost laughing. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. There was no reason why I should be getting arrested by armed cops. My confidence remained as they forced open the seats of our mopeds and threw our stuff to the ground. Some changes of clothes I'd stashed under the seat, nothing of note. One of the officers yanked the backpack off my back and emptied the contents onto the ground. I watched in dawning horror as an armed cop snatched up my passport and pocketed it. Then another cop began slicing open the seats of the mopeds. That's when my confidence really dissipated. I stared open-mouthed as they pulled 2 duct tape packages out of the seat cushioning that I'd spent the last few days sitting on. I didn't have to ask to know what I'd been sitting on, though. Struggling to look around at Milo, who was being nailed on by a cop, the look on his face caused my heart to completely sink. The absolute imbecile was not at all surprised to see the drugs. My best friend had implicated me in a freaking cocaine smuggling operation without my knowledge. No wonder it had been too good to be true. No wonder Pete was such a nice guy. I had known Milo had a few dodgy contacts and dabbled in very light dealing back at home, but I had no idea he'd done anything like this. Protesting my innocence did not help, though, as I was dragged into a waiting paddy wagon and then booked and processed in a Dutch jail and thrown into a single cell where I had nothing to do but sit, fret, and poop myself in fear. Not literally. I'd never even been in trouble with the law before, and the idea that I could genuinely be going to prison, that I had actually committed a serious crime, even unwittingly. The next few days were a blur of terror and anxiety. I could not make an international call to let Jane know what was going on. I could not get a hold of Milo and wring that idiot's neck while demanding he explain things. All I could do was talk to a couple of Dutch cops who barely spoke English, but knew just enough to tell me that I was in a whole heap of trouble. In the end, it was Pete who proved to be my savior, even if he was the ringleader and the guy to blame in the first place. Milo clammed up, refusing to say anything in my defense, but in the end Pete spilled everything and cut some kind of deal where he ratted out his suppliers. Part of the deal involved telling them that myself and 2 of the 3 other guys were just clueless patsies, brought along to drive the extra mopeds. Only Pete, Milo, and a 3rd guy, Jacob, were actually part of the drug smuggling. The day that a guy from the UK embassy came to visit me in my cell and told me I was going home, I genuinely fell to my knees and wept. I went home and hugged my mom and dad and had a bang-up Sunday roast. My homecoming to Jane wasn't quite so grand, though. I don't think she ever quite believed me that I wasn't involved in the criminal enterprise, and honestly, that really hurt. I'd never done anything to make her distrust me, and after 6 months of constant jibes and jokes about my complicity, I couldn't stand it anymore, and we actually ended up breaking up. Even though the Dutch law accepted that I had no knowledge of the drug smuggling, I was still deported and banned from entering the Netherlands for 10 years. That time's just up about now, and not sure why I'd ever want to go back though, unless for some reason I wanted to visit Milo, who's still serving 2 more years on his sentence. I have no sympathy for that idiot. Even after Pete spilled the beans, Milo pleaded not guilty and got a much longer sentence because of it. It's like the American Wesley Snipes said, "Some mother lovers always trying to drive a moped up a hill." Me and my missus are writing to you today to tell you about an absolutely messed up trip to the United Kingdom that we took a few years ago. It was just after COVID travel restrictions had been lifted, so we were itching to stretch our legs and visit a foreign country, so we picked somewhere as far away from home as possible. We didn't really have a plan for our UK holiday. It seemed like a nice place, so we opened up a map of Britain, stuck it on the dartboard at the bar that I co-own with my brother, and I threw a dart at it. Well, we missed, and I would have had to vacation in the Bristol Channel, so we threw another one and landed on Sussex. We didn't know anything about Sussex, and apparently it's not really a massive tourist destination, but we picked the funniest sounding place that also seemed a bit touristy, Bognor Regis. We figured if it was crap, it wouldn't be too hard to shoot up to London early, which we planned to do for the second half of the holiday regardless. Bognor Regis was actually great. We hit the town in July, dead in the middle of the Australian winter, and despite what we'd heard about the UK, the weather was bonzer. Me and the missus spent our days sunbathing on the beach, buying crap from the seafront stores and getting sunburned. Then, at night, we hit the bars and the clubs and tried our best to paint the quiet seaside town red. We made a bunch of friends at Bognor Regis, other tourists from all over the world, like Detroit, Belgium, Turkey, Birmingham, all sorts. One fella that we met, he said his name was Rishi, like the then Prime Minister, which we all found really funny. Rishi was a wild party animal, and it was with Rishi that we got so drunk one night that we found ourselves lost in the middle of the countryside, unsure how to get back to Bognor Regis. Me and the missus were both absolutely wrecked, and we lost track of Rishi altogether. We were out in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how we'd even managed to get there. I have a vague memory of riding in a van with Rishi and some other guys drinking cheap beer, but now me and the missus were walking along a country road in the dark, singing God Save the Queen. Rest in peace, Liz. Eventually, we came across a 24-hour petrol station and a service station. There was a Costa Coffee, but it was closed, and a McDonald's staffed by a very bored-looking teenage boy. We bought some munchies and then wandered to the gas station to see if they had the number for a local taxi firm or some type of ride. The guy at the counter directed us to a notice board, which we struggled to read in our drunken state, but eventually found a business card from someone offering taxi services 24 hours a day. I called it up on my mobile, and a very polite young woman answered. I told her where we were at, described the service station, and she said that she knew exactly where to send a driver. She told us to look out for a silver Ford and that our driver would be named Mears. Half an hour later, a car pulled into the petrol station lot, and a shifty-looking bloke gestured us over. I asked if he was Mears, and he said, sure, why not? Now, looking back, I can't be sure if we got into the right car. It's hard to get it clear in my head whether I'm just remembering things wrong or whether we really were this careless with getting into a car with a stranger. Either way, Mears, or whoever this crooked bogan was, did not have our best interests at heart. It wasn't immediately obvious. We had no bloody clue where we were, so we had no bloody clue that Mears was driving us in the total opposite direction to Bognor Regis. And by now, my missus had passed out and was snoring against my shoulder. I tried to make conversation with Mears from the back seat, but he suddenly pretended that he couldn't speak English. Weird, I thought. He'd understood me perfectly earlier. Or maybe I'd been so drunk that I just sort of slurred nonsense at him and he just sort of gone along with it. When we pulled up to a stop, I knew we definitely weren't in Bognor Regis. We were in the courtyard of some broken-down, filthy farmhouse that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, I saw a chicken run across the dirt in the darkness and at least one goat peering at me eerily from beyond a fence. Lovely, I thought. Mears got out of the car and yelled something into the darkness. A dog began to bark furiously and a male voice called back. I peered through the front windscreen from the back seat, squinting into the darkness, and saw two fellas join Mears. Mears had his window down so I could hear them, even though I don't think he knew that I could hear them. Fear gripped me as I realized what they were talking about. Mears was saying that we were rich American tourists. We're Australians, you wanker, I wanted to yell, and that nobody knew where we were, so they could just do us over and dump us in the acid vats out back. Bloody Nora, I thought. I didn't much fancy that either. And neither did one of the men because he vehemently disagreed with Mears, slapping him around on the back of the head even. And at first I thought this meant Mears had been kidding around. But no. The other man said that they just wanted to do me in, but the missus should be handed over to Osama and his boys, and they'd know what to do with her. I swear on my old dad's grave, when I heard Osama, I thought that they were just larrikins. But then Mears said something like, sure, maybe they'll hook us up with some of their fine, and then a derogatory term that implied that he was talking about very young women. Next, I saw the glint of steel as one of the men unsheathed some huge blade. Right, this could totally ruck off. Machetes, grooming gangs, a matey called Osama? Not bloody likely. Not for me and the missus. And I didn't even think. Drunk as an absolute skunk, I clambered into the front of the Ford Escort. The Lord God above must have been looking out for me that night because Mears the moron had left his freaking keys in the ignition. For a second I thought I was going to have a classic horror movie moment where the engine wouldn't take over and the car wouldn't start. But nah, luck was on my side. I gunned the engine and drove straight forward, even clipping Mears in the leg as he dived out of the way. Somehow, despite being a terrible driver even when sober, I managed to pull off a perfect U-turn and then send the car squealing, crashing out of the gate of the farmyard and onto the darkened country roads. I pushed that battered old Ford Escort to its absolute peak, breaking the speed limit for a good 20 minutes, hoping and praying that I'd encountered the law so they could pull me over and I could tell them everything. Eventually, I remembered the missus in the back. The lucky bird had slept through the entire thing and only now just started stirring, muttering and asking where we were and then telling me to slow down. Eventually, we found our way to a little village which had a 24-hour Tesco. Both our phones had run out of battery at some point in the night, so we went inside, and I told the poor old dear on the checkout that we'd almost been kidnapped by a grooming gang and could we possibly borrow the phone. I'd sobered up quite a bit by now, and I imagined I was still a total mess, and the missus was still rat-arsed. Now, long story short, the cops came, they searched some farmhouses in the area that could match the description I gave, but they didn't find anyone. And the car that we'd acquired had stolen plates, and had been reported stolen a few years before. The cops impounded it, and for all I know, it's still in some impound lot today. The name Mears was apparently the name of a local taxi driver and had not been the guy whose car we'd gotten into. They were able to verify that the real Mears showed up at the petrol station shortly after we got into the wrong Ford. The cops did confirm one chilling fact, though. Osama was the first name of a suspect in a grooming gang case in the area. Unfortunately, our testimony didn't really help anything with that case, but I hope to God they got him. Me and the missus got off pretty lightly, all told. I still have friends who to this day insist that I got so drunk I imagined this whole thing, but I have copies of the police reports as a souvenir from our time in Bognor Regis to prove it. And I can only wish total ill will upon the men who intended to kill us, especially fake Mears. I hope it hurt when I hit you with your own car, and if you ever come to Australia, I'll happily feed you to a kangaroo, you tosser. Back in the 2000s, I went on a girls' trip to Crete. For the most part, it was absolutely awesome, especially for a history nerd like me. I loved exploring all the ruins, taking in the local history, and hanging out on the beach. And unlike at home, it was totally fine to sunbathe topless, so my pale ass didn't have to end up with an awful tan line like I usually did on vacation. In theory, anyway. Of course, I was actually way too shy to do that, but it was nice to know that I could have if I wanted to. I mention this because it's irrelevant that I'm kind of a wallflower. I don't really like being the center of attention or doing any wild things. I'm not a party girl, never have been. At the time of this vacation, I was just out of college and I'd still never even been drunk. I drank a glass of wine or two with dinner, but that was the extent of it. I was much more at home among the ancient stones of Greece than I was in the clubs, even if that was the main purpose of this holiday. I was the sensible one of the group, the designated driver, the sober Sally, and I was okay with this. I'd still go out on the town with the other girls, but I'd be the one to head back to the hotel by 10 p.m. and then awake to see the sunrise. All this to say, when I went to some Cretan ruins with one of my friends, Nora, and we met a couple of local brothers who offered us something to drink, I made them swear on Zeus that it wasn't alcoholic. For one thing, it was early afternoon. For another, I wanted to keep a clear head on because I was planning on exploring some subterranean tunnels in the ruins, and they weren't entirely safe. We'd met the boys in the town the night before, and they had construction permits for the area which wasn't entirely open to the public. They assured me that the bitter purple drink was a local recipe, a natural energy drink made from dandelions and other plants. At any other time, I would not accept strange drinks from strange men, but we were also accompanied by the brothers' grandparents and a sweet and lovely old couple who also assured me that the drink was not alcoholic and would simply give me the energy and drive to explore the ruins. Obviously, it's clear from the setup that there was something wrong with the drink, but to this day I'm certain that the family didn't intend there to be anything wrong with it. They just didn't consider the fact that their beloved family recipe might require a bit of acclimatization for an American tourist who isn't used to drinking something that contains datura. For those who don't know, datura is a somewhat poisonous plant that can be used as a recreational hallucinogen. Later, the family told me that they only used a pinch of datura in their drink to give it a kick, but I barely even drank wine, let alone hallucinogens or poison. On top of that, I was unknowingly suffering from mild sunstroke. I'd spent all morning in the sun at the ruins, and I'd mostly only been drinking this bitter dandelion and datura juice, so I was sunstruck and absolutely dehydrated. All of this was a recipe for disaster when I went down into the tunnels under the ruins, armed only with a flashlight, and decided that I could absolutely manage it alone. It didn't take long for me to start panicking. It was cooler underground, but there were strange sounds. Soon I'd lost sight of any natural sunlight and only had my flashlight to guide me. I started sensing something was wrong soon after that. Whirls and chips in the rock began to form words and pictures in the darkness. I paused for 5 entire minutes, reading some ancient writing on the wall that suddenly turned back into meaningless rock texture. And next, I was certain that I could feel hot animal breath on my neck. I spun around, and of course nothing was there. Somehow, I got it into my mind that the ghost of a minotaur was down here with me, an invisible minotaur ghost, and I began to run down the corridors, as if that would somehow help if it was in fact a ghost. I ended up just getting myself more lost and then heard scraping and the skittering of small stones. I shone my flashlight down the corridor, and a small minotaur with a hairy face was standing there. At least, that's what I saw him as in my sunstroke-addled datura-brained state. The minotaur began to advance towards me, snorting and growling at me. A voice in the back of my mind was telling me that I was hallucinating. I couldn't possibly actually be seeing a minotaur. It was an invisible ghost minotaur after all. So I stood my ground and shone my flashlight at the creature and waited for it to pass through me and disappear. Instead, the minotaur reached out and grabbed me. Stinking foul wine breath washed over me as the beast bore down on me, and for some reason, the minotaur wore a filthy fisherman's coat and fishing pants too, and he had gumboots on and a beard and a knitted cap and was also an old man. Yeah, this wasn't a minotaur. It was a hobo lurking around in the ruins, and now he had his hands on me. My head was spinning, and colors were flashing around the tunnel like I was in a magic abyss. The hobo minotaur clacked his teeth at me and slobbered down his beard, and I felt him grabbing at the waistband of my pants. Hell no, buddy. I raised the flashlight up over my head and brought it down on his forehead with a crack. This caused this hobo minotaur to howl in enraged pain and let go of me, but it also caused the flashlight's beam to weaken quite considerably. I shoved the hobo roughly against a wall and ran past him, trying to follow the route that I was sure that I'd taken. And it was a chase sequence worthy of an actual slasher movie, not least because the hobo managed to grab me a couple of times and tear my shirt a bit. Thankfully, nothing revealing, and I would have been mortified, as we've already established. It was just enough to make me look kind of badass when I came running out of the tunnels, screaming that I was being chased by a freaking minotaur. And holy crap, someone call Olympus because there was an actual monster after me. Nora grabbed me and shook me and asked me what was really wrong. Nora had been drinking the Datura drink too, but didn't seem to be affected by it in the same way I was, maybe because she was used to alcohol and also didn't have sunstroke. I tried to explain that there was a beast, but then the hobo came charging out of the tunnel screaming and yelling. Later, our Greek friends wouldn't translate exactly what he'd said, but told me that it was obscene. The hobo rushed at me and grabbed me, throwing me to the ground and flipping me over. Nora punched him and I kicked, squabbling backwards away from him as he reeled back. The Greek guys we were with came running over, and one of them grabbed the hobo and threw him backwards. He stumbled across the area, hitting a pillar hard with his arm. Some debris dislodged from the top of the pillar and fell straight onto his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. I heard an absolute sickening crunch of bone as the rock pinned him down, and for a moment, I almost felt bad for him, until I remembered what he'd clearly been trying to do to me in those tunnels. The elderly couple told the grandsons to take us back to our hotel, and that they'd call the cops and get the hobo arrested for trespassing. They said it was better that we didn't let them know that we'd been in the ruins because we weren't strictly supposed to be there, and the Greek police can be a bit volatile. As much as I didn't... That said, it was better that we didn't let them know that we'd been in the ruins because we weren't strictly supposed to be there, and the Greek police can be a bit volatile. As much as I didn't want the hobo to get away with assaulting me, I was still very dizzy and confused from whatever was affecting me, and also judging from the state of the hobo and his crushed arm, he wouldn't be trying to assault anyone else anytime soon. I slept off the heat exhaustion and datura poisoning, and the next day we had a conversation with these Greek brothers in which we worked out that the datura in the cocktail was the likely culprit for my hallucinations, if you haven't already figured it out. And in some ways, I think their strange concoction actually helped. It gave me the energy to fight back against this hobo and escape through the tunnels, and maybe if I'd been faced with the dark reality of the situation down in those ruins, I might have fallen apart and been unable to escape. On the other hand, maybe if I wasn't high on datura and actually had heat stroke, I might not have gone into a labyrinth alone in the first place. But really, who can say? I've got a story about Canada that I want to share with you. My family and I are from Kentucky. There's me, my wife Ellie, my 20-year-old daughter, my 15-year-old son, and my 9-year-old daughter. We go on vacation to Europe most years, but last year we decided that it was finally time to get really exotic and head to Canada. We settled in a small village near the boreal forest and went about researching the perfect Airbnb to rent for a week of wilderness tranquility and enjoyment. My wife found the perfect place, very affordable too, and we booked it. A few months later, I headed up to Merry Canada with the fam in tow. My son Elijah spent the entire journey playing on his Switch and wouldn't pay attention to the beautiful natural countryside, but my wife and daughters were awestruck, and so was I. I hadn't been to Canada in many years and was bringing back a lot of fond memories. We arrived at the Airbnb, a stunning woodland property just off from the nearby village. The key was meant to be just inside this digital lockbox attached to the front of the house, But as we pulled up and got out, it was pretty clear that the box was hanging open. Great start. I tried the front door and it was locked, of course. Well, no problem. Thankfully, there was cell reception at the property, so I called up the number that we had for the owners, but no answer. Great again. Seconds later, we heard footsteps crunching under the driveway. An elderly couple waved to us and asked if we'd been calling them. They introduced themselves as the owners of the property and apologized if they were running late. They had the key with them and they could let us right on in. They were an odd-looking pair, I guess. The husband introduced himself as an ex-cop in his 70s, and he reminded me of one of the sort of Weeble toys from when I was a kid. Weeble wobbles, but won't fall down, you know the ones? He was completely hairless, like shiny bald and free of eyebrows, but he had a huge bushy beard that I kept staring at because I was certain it was a wig. Is that what you call a fake beard? To this day I don't even know, and the icing on the cake was his name. He said his name was Gerald Garibaldi, and I began to laugh when he said this, but my wife kinda elbowed me, and Gerald Garibaldi looked slightly excited, as if he had no idea what the joke was. And the wife introduced herself as Maureen Garibaldi, and the hair on her face wasn't a wig. It was unfortunate, but Maureen Garibaldi had a few thick whiskers sprouting from her chin, and a very prominent female mustache that looked like it hadn't been waxed since pretty much ever. Not that she had any obligation to actually wax, of course, but needless to say that they were a very odd-looking couple. My eldest, Cindy, and Elliot were elbowing each other, sort of whispering and laughing, and it was all I could do to keep a straight face when my youngest, Amy, kept asking what was so funny. Maureen was in her 60s and wore a flowery summer dress that was kind of obscenely short. She had long white socks on and those black shiny shoes that honest-to-God schoolgirls wear, and I'm ashamed to say that the pair of them kind of unsettled me. Gerald and Maureen Garibaldi led us into the house and then very kindly gave us a tour that somehow managed to last nearly 2 hours. Then, they very kindly helped us bring our luggage in from the car, and then kindly helped us unpack the kitchen things and food and other essentials, and then kindly sat there like eager puppies, clearly waiting for us to invite them to stay for dinner. It was the first night of our freaking vacation, though, and I really didn't want those weirdos encroaching on our family time, but hey, what could I do? They were very kind. And that phrase became a running joke because the Garibaldis continuously told us that we were very kind for this and that thing. Over dinner, Gerald Garibaldi talked and talked and talked, and the rest of us could just do nothing but listen. And the crazy thing is, I couldn't really tell you what he talked about. He just rambled about nothing and everything. Politics, movies, music, Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, cancel culture, the youth of today, animated violence, and those damn video games, all sorts of stuff. But I could not tell you a single thing he actually said or a single opinion he actually had. It was like the man was talking total gibberish, just saying snippets of things that made some sense or could pertain to something, but just didn't really fit together in any cohesive manner. And at one point he was talking about how Trump was the worst thing to happen to the country in years, but then 5 seconds later he was calling him the greatest damn president the country's ever seen. He kept bringing up Angela Merkel too, saying what an ugly troll she was, and Ellie and I fought to keep a straight face because I swear up and down Maureen Garibaldi could have been Angela Merkel's long-lost twin, separated at birth. Now imagine Angela Merkel dressed like a Lolita, I was told, and deepest apologies for the image, but that was Maureen Garibaldi, and don't ask me how I know any of that stuff. They were honestly like something from that weird show on TLC. I genuinely wanted to look around for hidden cameras. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely we were being pranked. Unfortunately, things didn't stay comical for very long. After dinner, the Garibaldis made themselves comfortable in the living room and turned the TV on. I took Ellie into the other room and asked her what the hell we were going to do. Amy was almost crying because she wanted to play board games, and Elliot and Cindy had already left to explore the outskirts of the forest before the sun had fully set. In the end, I had to very politely ask the Garibaldis if they would mind leaving for the night and letting us settle in. I expected them to display that Canadian embarrassment and a sort of aw shucks energy, but instead, Gerald Garibaldi decided to square up to me. He pushed me in the chest and accused me of being an ungrateful guest. They had allowed us into their abode, after all, and how dare we simply ask them to leave? What right did I have to try and throw a man out of his own home, especially after dinner? It started to dawn on me that these freaks did not realize how Airbnb was supposed to work. I mean, surely they realized that they were meant to leave the house while we stayed in it. And I gently tried to ask this, and they acted furious. Again, I almost thought that we were being pranked. Maybe this was one of those dumb YouTube things. But then Maureen began outright howling and crying and accusing us of being home invaders. I could not believe what I was hearing. When she threw some pretty vile slurs at Ellie, that's when I knew that this was definitely not a joke. I drew the line there. This had been funny for an evening, but it was beginning to ruin our much-needed vacation. And moreover, they were upsetting Amy, and nobody speaks to my wife like that. I have no idea, but demand that this couple leave their own property or I'd call the police. I wasn't even sure if this could fly legally, but what choice did I have? I could put a complaint in the Airbnb the next day, and if we had to find a nice hotel in the town over, then that would suck, but so be it. Surprisingly, the Garibaldis seemed terrified at the idea of me calling the cops. They heaved their considerable bulks off the couch and stormed out. Now I watched them leave, stamping their way around the outside of the house and into the forest. Now minutes later, Elliot came back in. I filled him in on what he'd missed and told him that the Garibaldis were unhinged and not to let them in if they came back. Elliot agreed and then asked where Cindy was. My heart sank. I thought she'd been with him. Elliot said she had been, but that she'd headed back to the house ahead of him because she needed to use the bathroom. Ellie was upstairs putting Amy to bed, so Elliot and I rushed outside to try and find Cindy. She was in a clearing with the Garibaldis. As I approached, I saw that Maureen was holding a damn shovel. As I got closer, I could hear what Gerald was saying. He was trying to persuade my 20-year-old daughter to come back with them to their house and have some sexy times with them. Cindy, who hadn't been present during the blow-up, was doing her best to be nice and not offend them, and I'm so proud of her for that. She was clearly worried about the shovel Maureen was holding, though, despite not knowing how volatile and weird this couple really was. I snuck out behind Maureen and grabbed the shovel from her hands. I told Cindy to get behind me, and that she didn't have to put up with this crap from these utter freaks. Maureen screamed at me, telling me that my family wasn't safe, and that they'd booby-trapped the house, and that there was a carbon monoxide leak that would poison us all in our sleep, and that they'd rigged the house to kill us. It was absolutely insane. I had no idea what we could do. There was no way that we could stay overnight in that house when the owners were this nuts. For the moment, I told Cindy to take Elliot back into the house. Then I kind of threatened the Garibaldis with the shovel, making sure they backed off and left the property. Once I was sure they waddled far enough away, I went back into the house. Inside, Ellie met me with some incredibly bizarre news. While I'd been out there dealing with the Garibaldis, she'd received a phone call on the Airbnb's landline. It was the owners, asking if we'd arrived okay and calling to wish us a pleasant stay. Of course, Ellie had told them that we'd spent an evening with the supposed owners, and my wife described the couple who'd intruded on our Canadian vacation. The actual owners, the McAvoys, told us to keep the door locked and that they'd be over with law enforcement shortly. Now, sure enough, 10 minutes later, a station wagon and a police cruiser pulled into the driveway, and that's how we met the real and very lovely owners of that Airbnb. There's a simple, if crazy, explanation for what had happened. The Garibaldis, which was not their real name, of course, were the neighbors of the McAvoys who'd been enraged on a land boundary dispute with them for years. They'd always been quietly resentful of the McAvoys, and always been an annoying but minor thorn in their side. When the McAvoys bought a second property on the other side of the Garibaldis' land, it all became too much for them, and they decided to try and sabotage the McAvoys' attempts at earning income through Airbnb by masquerading as the owners, the lunatic Garibaldis, to scare away any guests. Turns out, we were the first guests, and the Garibaldi's bizarre, grudge-driven plan almost worked. The utter weirdos had even managed to spy on the McAvoys to see the keypad code for the electronic lock and help themselves to the key. Unfortunately, that was the only real crime they'd committed, and even then it was their word against the McAvoys that they hadn't actually been told the key code. However, the Garibaldis, whose real names I won't use just in case, were known as menaces and troublemakers to local law enforcement, who were only too happy to put the scares on them enough that we had a mostly peaceful stay for the rest of our vacation. Which, I will add, the McAvoys gave us a severe discount on, meaning that for the most part, we got to spend a beautiful, tranquil vacation on the outskirts of the boreal forest for half the normal asking price. I say for the most part because there was one final scary incident before we left. On the day we were packing up to head out, after having had a great time, I was downstairs with Cindy packing up the kitchen. We heard a crash from the living room and ran next door to see that a stone had been hurled through the windows, smeared with what I can only hope was mud. We rushed outside to see a fat figure disappearing into the trees. I let the McAvoys know, and they informed the cops. I really hope for their sake that they installed some home security going forward. I do keep an eye on the Airbnb website to see if that property's ever been made available to vacationers again, and I've not seen it crop up since. It could be that the McAvoys decided that it wasn't worth trying to combat the Garibaldis, or it could just be that they're not renting through Airbnb anymore. Either way, I wish the McAvoys all the best. As for the bizarre, creepy couple, if you've ever come near my family again, I'll show you us US folk aren't quite as forgiving as our Canadian cousins. And I love the channel, but I'm gonna have to apologize in advance for how vague I'm gonna be here because this whole thing already caused a ton of crap for my family and I. I'm talking the kind of crap I wouldn't even wish on my worst enemy. And since I can't have it happening again, I'm gonna try and stay as faceless as possible here. So I was born into a family that had been very lucky when it comes to finances. We've had a bunch of money in the family going back generations, but for the longest time, all I knew was that it came from a forefather being a successful merchant back in covered wagon times. History wasn't my thing growing up, and my family didn't talk about it much either, so I didn't really know squat about it until just after I turned 16. And it all started on a Sunday morning. On my birthday, Dad told me that I could get a learner's permit and he'd buy me a car if I kept my grades up at school. And so I'm still walking on air as I pass Mom on the way to do her little grocery run. She made a joke about how I'd be driving her soon, and I was just like the Cartman in that South Park episode when he's lying on a pile of money just saying, "Yeah," with his big dumb smile on his face. I don't know if you remember that one, but after she left, I walked into the kitchen to make myself some breakfast. And then a minute later, all I heard was her honking her horn, and not just like a quick beep. It was like those long, prolonged, solid blasts. So me, my dad, and my two brothers went running out the door and down the driveway to see what had happened. And at first, I remember being terrified that some kind of freak car accident had killed her. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when I saw that she and her car were fine, but she was standing on the road with the door open, pointing at the wall outside of our house, and with her jaw practically grazing the ground. Because spray painted on the side, and in massive dark red letters, someone had written, "Blood Money Pigs are gonna pay." It was kind of scary at first because, while Blood Money Pigs is a cool name for an industrial metal band, it is not what you want to see spray painted on the wall of your house. But then once we thought about it, we figured it was probably some jealous a-hole wanting to vandalize a nice neighborhood, and we just so happened to be the unlucky house that they chose to dirty up, so to speak. Yet while he wouldn't share anything with us until much later, it wasn't long before my dad started to suspect their choice of target wasn't so random. And that's because after washing and repainting the wall, so it looked good as new, the exact same thing happened maybe 2 to 3 weeks later. Sunday morning, Mom goes on her little grocery run, then brrr, something else had been spray painted on the wall. "Blood on your hands," it said. Now, it was clear we were being targeted for some reason because no one else in the neighborhood ever reported any vandalism, but all we could really focus on at the time was why us. Mom was a homemaker and pretty popular with the other moms at school and around the neighborhood too, so it wasn't like she had any serious enemies. And then Dad spent his time running a charitable foundation that, long story short, was financed by the money his investment group made. He worked with sick kids, animal shelters, the homeless, you name it. Anyone who needed the help in, let's just say, the general vicinity, Dad could be counted on to show up with an oversized check for a handshake and a photo. Naturally, he too was a very popular man. So how in the name of all hell did we have blood on our hands? Mom and Dad ended up getting involved, and Dad paid to have some fancy security camera attached to the front gate. But then whoever was vandalizing the wall must have noticed, because the first thing they did the next time they showed up was spray the camera lens so it couldn't see them writing, "Kelsey Scum Leave Town," on the outside wall of our house. Now, they didn't just graffiti that time either. These vandals poured a bunch of gas or something over the wall and then set fire to the plants at the side of our driveway, most likely in the hopes that the whole place would catch fire and burn down. Like I said, Dad already had his suspicions regarding why we were being targeted, but it wasn't until the Kelsey incident that he had them confirmed. Yet he still kept Mom and us in the dark, and the meaning behind the Kelsey name was lost in the confusion. And by that I mean none of it made sense, so it's not like the name clicked with us like it did with Dad. He started paying for security to watch the street outside our house, which basically involved a pair of dudes taking turns keeping watch 24/7. And it was one of those security guys that chased off someone who was likely trying to follow us to school in the morning to see which ones me and my brothers went to. And that was the going theory, at least. We didn't have it 100% confirmed, but it was still enough to scare Mom and Dad into moving us out of that house for a while, at least until the cops could figure out what was going on. But like I said, Dad kind of knew what was going on. He just didn't tell our mother until we were safely someplace else. My brothers and I find out a whole other story too, but since it's way longer and takes place years after the graffiti stuff, I'll just write this like you're my mom finding out after we moved. So, sometime in the early 1840s, two of my ancestors made the journey from Kentucky to California. Andrew and Benjamin Kelsey bought cattle rights to a stretch of land near Clear Lake from a Mexican guy who worked with the local Pomo Indians to drive his herds. But when the Kelsey brothers took charge, assisted by a man named Charlie Stone, they weren't nearly as friendly with the Indians as the Mexican was. See, they came from Kentucky, which was a slave state, a place where it was very much a work or die type mentality, and while the Pomo wouldn't work for free, Andrew Kelsey paid wages that his own self would have found straight up insulting. Once they were set up, his brother Ben returned to some ranch they had and left Andrew and Charlie Stone to deal with the Pomo, and deal with them they did. One day, a disagreement between Charlie Stone and a Pomo warrior almost turned violent. Andrew Kelsey managed to defuse the situation and promised the Pomo better treatment, but just before dawn the next morning, he and Charlie rode around with their rifles, confiscating all the Pomo's weaponry at gunpoint. And after that, since the Pomo had no viable means of defending themselves, the two men ramped the mistreatment up to 11 and started cussing out or horsewhipping the Pomo whenever they were working too slow or did something wrong. And this went as well as you might imagine, and ended with the Pomo laying siege to the house Kelsey and Stone had built, which was apparently more like a fortress by that point, as they had an idea that the Pomo might rise up. Which is like a whole other level of a-hole, right? Now anyway, it's all going to hell down at Clear Lake, and somehow news of this got to Andrew's brother Ben, who showed up with a posse to chase the Pomo off. And while Ben was definitely exploiting his own band of Pomo back on his own ranch, he wasn't nearly as much of an a-hole as his brother, not at first anyway. To defuse the situation, he promised the Pomo generous pay if they'd hunt down a band of native cattle rustlers who had been bothering him. Turns out these rustlers had been bothering the Pomo too, so not only were they too happy to hunt them down, but they dropped their dispute with Andrew after getting a big pile of cash from Benjamin. And before he left, Benjamin also warned his brother to start treating the Pomo better, or they'd do the same thing and rise up all over again. You think he might have taken his older brother's advice, but Andrew's dumbass went right back to the same old routine and treated those Indians like crap again. With the help of a bunch of ranch hands he hired, Kelsey took the Pomo's weapons away again. But that time, he also took away their fishing gear too, meaning they were entirely reliant on him for all their food and other essentials, and he gave them next to nothing. This went on for a while, and then when a young Pomo boy asked for another cup of wheat to feed a sick mom, Charlie Stone shot him dead on the spot to make an example of him to the others. Having gotten word of how the same pattern of mistreatment was playing out again, Ben Kelsey rode over to his brother's land and hired 50 Pomo men to take part in a gold mining expedition. But after Ben got sick with malaria, the Pomo stayed put and ended up getting picked off one by a combination of malaria and hostile tribes. Ben didn't mean any of them to die, but when word reached their families, they became incredibly angry. And then after a Pomo girl went missing for a few days, they turned up again saying that Andrew had been keeping her prisoner and using her as a love slave, and the crap well and truly, at that point, hit the fan. A Pomo chief snuck into Andrew's gunpowder store before dawn one morning and poured water all over it to make it unusable. And then once the sun came up, a band of warriors attacked Andrew's house with bows and arrows that they'd been making in secret. They took him by complete surprise and had him shot full of arrows before he even had time to react. Charlie Stone ended up shooting down a couple of warriors, and then he tried escaping by jumping out of a window but hurt himself on landing. He tried running, but he obviously couldn't. Then, after easily running him down, and this is according to my dad, the Pomo warriors bashed his head in with a rock, as a way of saying that he was too low and dishonorable to be killed with regular weapons. A few weeks later, when Ben Kelsey heard about what happened, he rode down to Andrew's place with a hired posse to recover his body. And that's when the massacre really started, because as they went, they killed every single Pomo Indian they could find. Ben and his boys killed so many of them that on account of all the public outrage, they ended up getting arrested when they returned home. Dad said the case was the first ever to reach the California Supreme Court, but in the end, none of the men were ever tried for anything, and when the army refused to help him drive the Pomo out, Ben Kelsey threatened to take an even bigger posse out there to finish them off himself. In the end, the army sent out a bunch of cavalry to move the Pomo on, but their commander was very sympathetic to Ben's story and had no intention of peacefully moving anybody off the land. When he and his men found the Pomo camp, they found it defenseless, as mostly all of the younger warriors were off on a big deer hunt someplace. They left only 400 Pomo, mostly women, kids, and old people, and the army killed around half of them. The army also killed just less than 100 more Pomo as they rode back to base camp, and while Ben Kelsey didn't directly take part in this, the greater part of the massacre, it can't be said that he didn't have a hand in it. Dad said that the way it was told to him when he was a kid, Ben Kelsey was basically cursed after that. He ended up selling his land in California, then moved the family to Mexico for some time, and then on to Texas, and it was there that, in a weird twist of vengeance, one of his daughters barely survived being violated and scalped by a Comanche warrior when their wagon was attacked. The ordeal scarred her mentally for life, and she was basically kept in the house all the time with no one allowed to see her because the sight of any strange person would send her into wild fits of screaming and crying. And to get away from the place that almost took his daughters from him, Ben moved the whole family back to California, where he got into the mining business. He then spent his twilight years in Los Angeles before dying in his 70s in the 1880s. Benjamin Kelsey had made a ton of money by the time he died, and it was all shared out among his surviving kids, one of whom ended up being my grandpa's grandpa. He invested it wisely, the fortune kept on going, then by the time it was all handed off to my dad, he could afford to create the foundation and basically pay a bunch of people to manage all of his stocks and whatnot for him while still making stupid amounts of money. No, I'm not gloating, I'm just being real, and while I am proud of my dad for being sensible and not blowing the fortune, which does happen a lot, I guess all that money really can be traced back to a single source, which was the Kelsey brother mistreating and massacring the Pomo, while making a ton of money in the process. I guess someone figured that out and then traced the family line down right to my dad before deciding that they were going to try and get some late-in-the-game revenge on behalf of the natives. And while I don't condone what they did, I can definitely understand why they were so mad when they read about the massacre, because I sure as hell was too. And as you can probably tell, I've done a lot of research on what the Kelseys did, and I've read a bunch of other books on the wider subject of U.S. Native relations. They vary wildly depending on where you're looking and when, and it's not always so black and white as people on Twitter want you to believe. But in the case of what they call the Bloody Island Massacre, it's clear to me that there were a bunch of Indians living relatively peaceful lives someplace, and then when these 3 American guys showed up, it signaled the doom of hundreds of innocent Native people. And that's just depressing and enraging and shameful in a way that I don't think I can put into words. It's obviously not mine or my dad's fault for what happened in the past, so I don't think we deserve to be targeted for what some guy did almost 200 years ago. But at the same time, I know for certain which charity I'm going to send a bunch of my inheritance to on the day it arrives. And that's the Lucy Moore Foundation, a non-profit organization founded to educate the public about what my ancestors did. It's named after a survivor of the massacre, a 6-year-old girl who hid underwater in the lake and breathed through some kind of hollow reeds so she didn't have to come up for air. And sometimes, I think I'd swap all that money that we got in our family just so she wouldn't have to go through what she did. My name is Marie, I'm from France, and a few years ago, I decided to do some research on my family tree. To be specific, I wanted to know what my ancestors were doing around the time of the French Revolution, and my sister agreed it would be cool to know their story from that time, but strangely our mother didn't seem nearly as enthusiastic. She kept asking things like, "Why do you care? It was such a long time ago," or "Why are you wasting time on the past when you should be looking for a husband?" In a sense, I understood where she was coming from. I was single at the time, and my mother has always been very vocal about her desire for grandchildren. But I now know her questions were coming from a very different and much darker place in her mind. Tracing my great-grandparents was easy, but from there, things got more and more difficult until I hit a dead end. The earliest relative I could find was a woman named Marie-Louise Pauline Blanc, who died in 1850. Yet for some reason I couldn't find any records detailing the location or date of her birth. She had a few brothers and sisters, including Louise Marie, who died in Paris in 1881. Yet once again there was no information on where or when she was born, only that the first records of her existence in France began in 1834 when she was already a grown woman. Record-keeping from the time is notoriously unreliable or frustratingly incomplete, so at the time, I didn't find anything overly unusual about the absence of information. But then I discovered Marie-Louise and Louise Marie, who I suspected of having a very uncreative mother, had another sibling, a brother named Jean-Pierre Pauline Blanc, who helped me figure out why there was no record of my family in France prior to the 1830s. Because Jean-Pierre hadn't died in France like his sisters. He'd died across the Atlantic, in the storied city of New Orleans. I had no idea my ancestors were colonists, or that at least one of our family had made their way across the ocean to the New World. My sister was excited by the news and bid me to keep up my research. I believed our mother would react with the same kind of indifference, asking why I was bothering to dig up the past when it had no bearing on our present. But to my surprise, when I mentioned that one of our ancestors made his home in the Americas, she acted like I had spoken of raising the dead. She begged me to stop what I was doing and not to dig any further because pain and suffering was all it would bring. And it was then, and only then, that I realized that she knew a lot more than she was telling me. I gave her an ultimatum. Either she told me what she knew about her ancestors, or I'd keep on researching and find out for myself. And then after inviting me over to the house, this is what she told me. Our ancestors had migrated to New Orleans, but had done so via Ireland at the behest of Louis Barthélemy de McCarthy. It's unclear how the Frenchman earned his Irish second name. And there, he and his wife had a daughter they named Marie Delphine, who was born March 19th in 1787. Marie Delphine was just 4 years old when the Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791. Enslaved Haitians cast off the shackles of servitude, and the revolution peaked with the massacre of thousands of French colonists and slave owners whom their former slaves referred to as barbarians. Before the massacre of the French, the colonists punished enslaved rebels by binding them together, loading them onto ships, and then tossing them into the Caribbean Sea to drown. A French general also pioneered a primitive form of a gas chamber, locking hundreds of black prisoners in the holds of these ships and burning sulfur to asphyxiate them en masse. But that's not all. The French imported specialized Cuban bloodhounds trained to track, maul, and eat enslaved Haitians, sometimes holding public spectacles in amphitheaters where prisoners were bound to stakes and torn apart by these dogs for the entertainment of French officers. Yet most offensive to the enslaved were the public crucifixions that captured rebels were subjected to. Seeing their fellow rebels hanging from crosses, burned alive, or broken on Catherine wheels inspired the massacre that would follow. And as stories of the violence made their way to New Orleans, terrified slave owners either improved their slaves' living conditions dramatically or subjected them to even harsher treatments in the hopes that it would break their spirits and reduce the chances of their revolt. In fact, Marie Delphine's uncle had been murdered by his own slaves in 1771, and as a family of slave owners, their solution was to treat their slaves as animals. In June of 1808, a then 21-year-old Marie Delphine married a man named Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator. At the time of the marriage, Blanc purchased a house at 409 Royal Street for the family, which became known later as the Villa Blanc. Delphine had 4 children by Blanc, one of which was our direct ancestor. But the marriage did not survive, and in June of 1825, it seems Marie had a thing for June weddings. She married her third and final husband, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalaurie. After which she went by the name that she would take to her grave, and the one by which she is infamous, Madame Marie Delphine Lalaurie. In 1831, Madame Delphine had a 2-story mansion constructed at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name and with little involvement of her husband following their eventual separation. She lived there with her children, but the household was maintained by black slaves, and in line with her own family's treatment of their slaves, they were treated abominably. I found mention of Madame Delphine in a book by Harriet Martineau, an Englishwoman who wrote books about sociology, and she mentions that even in a place where black slaves were treated as less than animals, Madame Delphine's slaves were, and I quote, singularly haggard and wretched. This stands in stark contrast with Madame Delphine's public treatment of black people, both free and enslaved, as Martineau noted that she was generally polite to them and seemed to care a great deal about their physical health. Yet official records tell a very different story. Between 1830 and 1834, local funeral registers show that 12 of Madame Delphine's slaves passed away, but the cause of their deaths are not listed. These include a cook named Bonne, listed as a chronic runaway, along with her 4 children. Their deaths caused such an uproar in New Orleans that rumors of grave mistreatment circulated and eventually prompted a visit from a local lawyer who intended to remind Lalaurie of the laws for the upkeep of enslaved people. Yet this lawyer found no evidence to suggest wrongdoing or mistreatment of enslaved peoples by Lalaurie, and the report of his findings seemed to have adequately quelled the rumors, at least for a while anyway. Author Harriet Martineau was still present in New Orleans when one of Madame Lalaurie's slave girls fell from the roof of the Royal Street mansion. An eyewitness said that the 8-year-old girl was attempting to escape punishment and was being pursued at the time by a whip-wielding Madame Lalaurie. It was later discovered that the young girl's name was Leah, and that she'd been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, angering Lalaurie to the point that she grabbed a whip and started chasing her. The incident led to another investigation whereby Madame Lalaurie was found guilty of illegal cruelties and forced to give up 9 of her slaves. Yet through some horrible twist of fate, these slaves were then brought back by the Lalauries through an intermediary relative and thus returned to the mansion. One such slave, the cook who replaced the deceased Bonne, was chained to the stove and had her children beaten mercilessly whenever she failed to live up to Madame Lalaurie's standards. The situation reached breaking point in April of 1834 when a fire broke out at Lalaurie's mansion. It was later discovered this fire was started by the cook, a 70-year-old woman who was chained to that stove by her ankle and who said she herself had deliberately started the fire rather than face yet another punishment of watching her children being beaten. This cook also claimed that any slaves were taken to the uppermost room, never to come back. Bystanders who witnessed the fire attempted to enter the mansion to ensure everyone had been evacuated, yet it was reported that Madame Lalaurie refused to hand over the keys. In response, these bystanders broke down the mansion's doors, and it was then, while going from room to room and looking for survivors, that they discovered all manners of horror. 7 of the slaves were found hanging by their arms, legs, or necks, with one witness saying their limbs were stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. Another witness was a local judge named Jean-Francois Canonge, who claimed to have seen a black woman forced to wear an iron collar, as well as an older slave woman with a head wound so dire that she could not stand properly. Canonge said that when he questioned Lalaurie's husband about those enslaved on the property, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. When word of Monsieur Lalaurie's most unrighteous indignation spread, a mob of local citizens attacked the Royal Street mansion and, according to one bystander, destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. The local sheriff and his officers were called to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. Madame Lalaurie's surviving slaves were taken to a local jail, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because the judge wanted people to see them, so they'd know how they'd been treated and know the evil that Madame Lalaurie had done. The grounds of the mansion were also dug up, and the bodies of several slaves were said to have been exhumed, including that of little Leah, who fell from the roof. People were furious with the Lalaurie family and wanted her hanged, but by that point she had already fled New Orleans for France. The mansion was later rebuilt, and through my own research, I discovered that actor Nicolas Cage had bought the house for a sum of $3.45 million in April of 2007, but the documents were arranged in such a way that Cage's name did not appear on them, and he later sold the property, so he's no longer the owner. Madame Lalaurie lived out the rest of her life in exile in Paris, but missed New Orleans terribly. She actually planned to travel back at one point, but her children convinced her not to, quite rightly saying that she'd probably be killed. Her eventual death in 1849 remains something of a mystery, with some saying that she died in a boar hunting accident, others of natural causes. But what's clear is that even in Paris, she was hated by all who knew what she'd done, and I can count myself among that number. It was very hard for my mother to reveal who our ancestors were. She didn't want me to be burdened with it like she had, but I'm glad she told me. I'm glad I know where I came from, because it's a reminder to be different, and God willing, if I have my own children, I'll raise them to appreciate the value of human life in a way that Madame Lalaurie never did. Growing up, I never knew my paternal grandparents. I was told they died before I was born, but that wasn't entirely true. And it wasn't until my early 20s when I was finally told this story that I realized that I had an uncle I'd never met, too. My dad told me the story after he found some pot baggies in my room, kind of like a way of saying, you don't want that life. And boy, did he ever make his point. So, my dad was born at the tail end of the Depression, meaning he, my grandparents, and his siblings grew up in extreme poverty. They ranged in age pretty wildly too, because when my grandpa was still in diapers, his eldest brother was like 18 or 19, that sort of age. And they were so poor that Dad and his siblings sometimes went to bed without any dinner, and when they did eat, it was all Depression-era meals like hard times soup or poor man's pie. Dad said he didn't even get a pair of shoes until he was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and then my grandma and eldest aunt actually shared a pair so my aunt could walk to school and back. It was that kind of hard for them. Not just poor, but dirt poor, you know? And then one day, everything changed. From my dad's perspective, all he noticed was how his ma and pa got real happy all of a sudden, and how the family moved to a much nicer place not longer after they suddenly got happy. They ended up moving to an even bigger place a short while after some big funeral, one that everyone in the county went to, and from then on, things were never the same. Grandma and Grandpa started fighting all the time, then Grandpa and my mysterious uncle got into a big fight too, apparently, and the next morning, Grandpa was gone. Just left a note on the table saying he was sorry along with a whole bunch of money. He was never seen again. No one knew if he lived or died or what happened to him. My uncle, the one I never met, had left some time after, but maybe a year later, Grandma got word that he'd been killed in a bar fight out of state. And that's how my dad grew up. His own dad, gone by the age of 10, to be raised by a single mom who worked herself into an early grave, making sure her kids wanted for nothing. But before she died, she told him the story of what happened to them, why their lives were suddenly transformed for the better one day and then suddenly destroyed out of nowhere. So one day, back when Dad was around 6, Grandpa came home in a totally different mood than he normally would. He usually came home tired and cranky after a long day of either working or looking for work, but on this occasion, my grandma said that he walked through the door with a spring in his step. He picked her up, spun her around, and told her that in 1 week's time, all their money troubles would be over. When she asked how that could be, Grandpa drew a finger to his lips and said, while he couldn't tell her, his word was his bond. Now, sure enough, 1 week later, Grandpa came home with a bundle of cash after being out all night with my uncle, and so began the good life for my dad and his family. But something happened around that time that didn't pass Grandma by, and she took to wondering just how exactly Grandpa had laid his hands on all that cash. You see, the same morning Dad came home with his money, a local farmer was found murdered outside his home. There was a big hoopla about it, and this farmer was a holdout, refusing to sell to this big land baron who wanted to turn his fields into a grazing space. He was offered larger and larger amounts to vacate his land, but he refused every time. All he wanted was to farm his land just like his pa did before him, and then hand it all off to his son once he was reunited with the Lord. That old land baron vowed to get the farmer's land by hook or by crook, so when he was found stabbed to death in the early morning, folks were obviously outraged, and they suspected the baron. Nothing came of it. All the baron's boys had alibis and what have you, so the sheriff suspected outside involvement, like a man for hire. Grandma was so worried that she actually confronted Grandpa about the money and demanded he finally tell her where he got it from. She's always assumed it was from running moonshine since that was still a big thing at the time, but after the farmer's murder, she got to wondering and worrying, enough to ask him to his face, but Grandpa swore he had no part of it. He swore on the Bible that he'd made that money moonshining and that never in his wildest dreams would he kill another man, and a good man at that, for nothing but a pile of blood money. Grandma said she was reassured, but she still never fully lost her suspicions. The timing was too right, and the pile of money seemed way too big for just a single moonshine run. but since he made his case well enough, she didn't question it out loud again. Not until a couple of months later when the farmer's son showed up dead. It looked like nothing more than a terrible accident. The farmer's boy was riding on his horse one night when something like a rattlesnake gave him a scare. The horse bucked him, he fell off, then broke his neck. Simple as that. A lot of people bought it and said how sometimes it's a case of bad things happening to good people, but not everyone saw it for what it was, and as far as I'm concerned, they were right not to. Because the morning after the farmer's boy fell from his horse and broke his neck, my grandpa came home with yet another pile of money. The farmer's boy had actually been set to sell his parcel of land off to the Baron, and at a very fair price too from what Grandma heard. But then right at the last minute, he changed his mind and refused to sell, saying he wanted to honor his dad's wishes. Tradition still means something around here, so everyone celebrated the decision, and that's not even a month or two later, and what do you know? But the farmer's boy has an accident. There was no investigation that time, and since the farmer's widow couldn't handle the day-to-day, she opted to sell it all off to the Baron, only this time at a much, much lower price. There was another big funeral again, and like I said, another big pile of money. But since Grandma had been talking about a moonshine run for weeks in advance, she didn't think much of the timing. Or at least she tried not to think much about it, because the more she did, the more it ate at her. But then over time it got harder and harder not to think about it on account of the way my grandpa and uncle were acting. Part of the reason she was able to forget as much as she did after that first quote-unquote moonshine run was how Grandpa and Uncle acted. They weren't acting like they'd done anything wrong. They were drinking to celebrate, and they were very happy with the family's newfound wealth. But then after the second quote-unquote moonshine run, they were about as opposite as could be. It was like a dark cloud was hanging over each of them. They were surly. They hardly slept at all, and they were either drinking, playing poker, or arguing in hushed voices out on the porch at night. And then one night, after hosting a poker game at the house, the whole situation came to a head. One of the guests made a joke about killing a man over a game of cards, something which my uncle took great offense to. He asked the guest if he knew what it was like to kill a man, and then when the guest said no, scared and confused at my uncle's dark turn, he was told that he should shut his mouth and not joke about such serious things. The situation escalated to the point where my uncle made a not-so-veiled reference to having himself taken a life, and that's when Grandpa exploded. He beat the living hell out of my uncle, right there in front of the poker guests, then dragged him off to the woodshed and locked him inside to sober up. And after that, Grandma confronted her husband for a second time and asked him straight up if he'd gotten all that money from murdering the farmer and son. Grandpa never admitted it, but he broke down in front of her. Then he cried, and he cried, and he cried, for a long, long time, according to Grandma. He was drunk to high heaven, but it wasn't the whiskey that was stopping the words from coming out. Grandpa was just too distraught to speak on whatever was tearing the family apart. She laid him up in bed, tucked him in, then talked him off to sleep. Then Grandma went outside, unlocked the woodshed, and did the same to her boy, who was also in dire need of medical attention too, from what my dad remembered. Now, this meant Grandma didn't get her own self to bed for another couple of hours, and then when she woke up the next morning, sometime after dawn, she noticed my grandpa wasn't lying next to her. She got up to go look for him, and he was gone, and in his place, there was a big pile of money on the table, and a note saying how sorry he was for everything. Grandma pressed my uncle on what he and Grandpa had done, but kept up the lie about moonshining, most probably out of fear for the noose, but also because he was too damn proud to tell the goddamn truth. He ended up running away his own self not long after, but unlike Grandpa, where no one ever heard a word about him and his fate is a total mystery, my uncle ended up dying in a bar fight. Someone caved his head in with a piece of furniture, and I heard they swung for it too. Mom was real sad when they got the news, but she didn't cry at his funeral. not like my dad and his siblings did, because in a sense, her son was dead already. It was just a matter of time before it caught up with him. Grandma ended up moving upstate, where she took a second husband. She died before my dad turned 18, some say of a broken heart, and the man she married stepped up and raised her kids like his own until they were all ready to fly the nest. I never got the chance to meet the man. Heck, I never got a chance to meet my grandma or grandpa, but if I did, I'd shake the man's hand for stepping up and being the father my own grandpa should have been. Because despite all he'd lived through, my dad turned out to be a pretty okay guy, and I miss him very much. So this is kind of an old one, and nothing to do with me really, but I think you'll enjoy it because it's a good one. So I didn't know this until I was like 20-something, but it turns out I'm descended from a man named John Stratton, who was part of the first wave of Americans to come over. Now, it's all total word of mouth, like it isn't even in any history books as far as I know anyway, but the story goes that he arrived with his family in 1610, right around the time the colony was set to be abandoned because everyone was starving. He sailed on a relief ship commanded by a guy called Baron de la Warre, who the state of Delaware is named after, and their arrival was hugely celebrated because it meant the colony could keep going. But my forefather, being a deeply religious man, didn't think much of the colony at all. He sent for his family not long after he'd secured a home for himself, but I guess he was always planning on leaving, because while he was waiting for them to arrive, he went around recruiting a bunch of other like-minded religious types to form a sort of breakaway colony. When his family arrived, John pulled the trigger and announced that he, his family, and several others were headed out into the wilderness to form a village of their own, one that would actually obey God's laws instead of flouting them like they did in Jamestown. I guess I do kind of see things from his perspective too, because Jamestown docks were basically a haven for all kinds of scumbag pirates, not to mention the working girls who served them. So if he was super religious like he was, it figures he got sick of it and decided to leave. Now anyways, so John and the other Puritan families left Jamestown sometime in 1611 and made their way into the woods until they found a clearing that'd make a good space for a small village. They built everything from the ground up, and then within a couple of years, the village was thriving. They'd hauled timber and animal skins back to Jamestown to trade for other goods, but aside from that, they didn't want anything to do with them. They lived by the Bible's laws and used it like a kind of early game constitution, citing its verses whenever they needed a solution to a problem or needed to resolve a conflict. So, time goes by, and something like 10 years after the village was founded, John Stratton was calling himself a minister and was basically the village patriarch who guided his flock in all manners, both earthly and heavenly. But from what I can gather, he had two major problems. The first were the natives, because by 1620, relations had worsened dramatically and it seemed like war between themselves and the settlers was coming no matter what. But the second of John's two problems came in the form of his own flesh and blood. John had around 9 sons and daughters, and they're just the ones who survived. And while the majority of them honored their mother and father, like the Bible told them to, one of them wasn't nearly so unquestionably obedient. And to me, Thomas Stratton sounds like a lot like your average teenager these days. He thought the village was boring and lame, and he wanted to go back to Jamestown, and all he had to do was hunt, smoke tobacco, and go walking with his village crush, the girl he wanted to marry. But on the other hand, his dad either wanted him in church or in the fields, and said he was too young and cocky to be a hunter without hurting either himself or someone else. But as you can imagine, this wasn't what young Thomas wanted to hear, and he disobeyed his dad more than once by heading out into the woods and trying to catch deer without permission. John forgave his son for the first time he caught him, but he warned him not to do it again. Then when he did and showed a complete disregard for his dad's wishes, John Stratton decided to make an example of his son. Thomas was still only 14 or 15 at this time, so John had no problem dragging him into the small village square and holding his son down while he dragged down his pants. He then spanked his boy, like spanked his bare ass in front of everyone while quoting lines from Proverbs. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. And train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is told he will not depart from it. I guess John figured that this would fix his boy and that public humiliation would make him think twice about being disobedient in the future. But as most of y'all can probably guess, it didn't do anything of the sort. Being publicly shamed and spanked made Thomas hate his father. I mean, go figure, right? But he went from some happy-go-lucky rebellious teenager to open defiance, returning the shows of public humiliation on a daily basis by refusing any command that John saw fit to give him. Thomas refused to even hunt when given direction, and would wait until his dad asked him to do something else before grabbing his musket and heading off into the woods with the family's hunting dog. And this kept going on for years, with John getting angrier and despairing over what to do with young Thomas. But by that time, Thomas was basically a grown-ass man, one who could use a musket really well and couldn't be dragged into the town square for a spanking. John waited years hoping his son's rebellious streak would disappear if he just ignored it. But when Thomas finally announced he was leaving the village and was returning not just to Jamestown, but to England, John decided that was not going to happen. The night before Thomas was due to leave for Jamestown, his father gave the impression that he'd accepted it, but was still sad to see him leave. John and Thomas had a little heart-to-heart about how the younger of them needed to make his own way in life, and I'm guessing they must have done the 1600s version of hugging it out, because when Thomas went to bed that night, he didn't suspect a thing. Meanwhile, once Thomas is asleep, his dad goes round and rounds up all the men in the village who were ride or die loyal to him. And then they snuck into Thomas's bedroom, dragged him out of bed, and beat the living crap out of him till he was either out cold or punch drunk enough to drag him off into the woods without him trying to fight. They dragged him out to a spot that John had spent some time the previous day. But while he claimed that he was only going into the woods to talk God, he'd also been mighty busy digging a big old pit that they threw Thomas into when they arrived. John and his buddies then went about burying Thomas up to his chest in soil, and then by the time his senses returned to him, his hands were tied and it was too late to do anything but struggle against the weight of all that soil. Thomas begged his father to let him go, but all John did was quote a verse from Deuteronomy, and the one about what to do with rebellious children. And for the sake of the story, I'll just copy and paste the most relevant parts so you all have an idea of the last things Thomas heard. Bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of a place where he lives, and they shall say to the elders of his city, This is our son, stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, so that all the people will hear and fear. After that, when John was done explaining himself to his son, he and his buddies picked up the rocks that they'd piled in a wide circle around the hole. Then they started throwing them at the boy as hard as they could. They smashed the boy's head into a bloody pulp, and they didn't stop until they were absolutely certain he was dead. And then, according to the story, they dug the hole out a little more, laid him in what had always been intended as a grave, then piled the earth on top of him again and walked back to the village. John told everyone that Thomas had left early that morning, and that he'd wished him well on the road back to Jamestown. I don't know exactly how it happened, but the truth got out somehow. My great-aunt Kathy says that she was told that some wild dogs dug Thomas's body up and a hunter found pieces of him all over the woods. But my mom says that she heard it differently, and that John actually confessed to his wife about what he'd done, who reassured him that he'd done the right thing. Either way, John almost completely got away with it, and if it wasn't for one of his other sons who let everyone know what had happened to poor Thomas, I don't think anyone would have ever found out the truth. Things went on as normal for a year or so, and then remember I said about relations between the natives and the settlers breaking down? Well, apparently in 1622 the natives got sick of the tobacco farmers encroaching on their lands, and they went on a major killing spree, burning down whole villages and slaughtering anyone who lived there. And yeah, you guessed it, John Stratton's little religious fiefdom was one of those villages. And if it wasn't for our ancestor escaping with his scalp to Jamestown, I most probably wouldn't be around to write this and keep the story alive of what a piece of human garbage he was for murdering his own son. My name is Rustlin, and I'm almost 60 years old, living in Brighton Beach here in Brooklyn. Now, I listen to your podcast a lot when I drive my cab, which is all I do, all day, every day pretty much, just driving my cab. But things never used to be this way. You see, I emigrated to the United States in 1992, a short while after my country disappeared overnight. But before that, I was a forest ranger in central Russia, where Europe meets Asia, in a place called Yugidva. Now, the Yugidva National Park is spread across the western slopes of Russia's Ural Mountains, which was about 1,600 kilometers east of Moscow. Now, there is a tundra at the highest elevations, while meadows cover the lower. But more than half of the park is covered in boreal forest of pine and spruce. At almost 19,000 square kilometers, it is a very big place. And to put that into perspective for you, the entire landmass of Kuwait is only 17,000 square kilometers, meaning the park is even bigger than some entire countries. Seeing as it's in quite a remote location, there are other parks with much easier reach of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The park received relatively low levels of tourism, with only a few thousand people visiting each year. Seeing as it's in quite a remote location, there are other parks with much easier reach of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the park received relatively low levels of tourism, with only a few thousand people visiting each year. Now, back when I worked there, those visitors were often the families of Red Army soldiers stationed at nearby bases, as it was an encounter with one such soldier in 1987 that marked the beginning of the events that I'm about to share with you. My official title while working for the park was Lishnik, which loosely translates to forester. Now, we don't have rangers, and I find this a very American concept. We were not offered fancy titles under socialism, and we did not require them to do our jobs. We were foresters, one and all, and that's what I responded to when I heard it barked at me from down a trail one day. It was high summer, the busiest time of the year in terms of tourism, and I was walking along a woodland trail when I suddenly heard someone shouting from behind me. "You there, forester, come here now." Now, in that moment, I turned to see a man out of uniform, but I could tell just from the way he addressed me that he was an officer in the Red Army. I had served a few years in the Army myself when I was a much younger man, enough to know its officers shared the same collective personality, that which my American neighbors called jerk-offs. I like this word, and it almost sounds like a Russian word. And as he marched towards me, quick and angry, I turned to face him. Now, behind him stood his family, a wife and 2 young children, a boy and a girl. But unlike the officer, who appeared furious, all 3 of his family looked very shaken, like they had seen something which frightened them deeply. Now, when I asked the officer what the problem was, he exploded. He told me some strange person was wandering around the forest, and that this man had deliberately set about to intimidate his wife and children as they sat down for a picnic. I asked for a description of the man, and the officer described him as being tall, dressed in dark furs, and wearing a hat that appeared to have been made from a bear's head. Now, at first, he didn't outwardly threaten the family. He just simply watched them from a distance and opted for a silent staring contest when challenged by the officer. But then, when the officer took a few steps in his direction, the man wearing the bear's head began to charge at them. The officer said his children began to scream, and he believed he was going to have to fight the man to protect them. Yet just in the style of the beast which sat atop his head, it was a false charge, and after having scared the officer's wife so terribly that she was crying, he stopped and then walked off laughing at the terror he'd sown. Now, to me, it sounded like a hunter who drunk too much vodka, but when I suggested that, the officer made it clear that the man was no hunter. He carried no visible weapon. All he had was madness in his eyes. Now, he also suggested that I find him and fast because if the man wasn't apprehended by the end of the following week, there'd be hell to pay. So later that day, myself and one of my fellow foresters got to work trying to find the so-called crazy man who wore a bear's head for a hat. Now, we had an old UAZ 469 back at Central Headquarters, one which we nicknamed the Goat. It was loud, the brakes were lousy, and riding in it for long distances put bruises on your butt. So, not necessarily the greatest of all time, like my friend's kid says about the Dagestani fighter. The Goat wasn't gentle, but it was reliable, and it was easy to repair. And then with so much ground to cover to do our jobs, we loved it like the Huns loved their horses. We drove out to where the officer had spotted the man wearing the bear's head, and then we went walking around the woods for hours, looking for tracks or leftovers from campfires or animal butchery. Now, the park used to get a great deal of illegal hunting, especially during the autumn months, which certain poorer families wanted to stock up their larders for the long Russian winters that I do not miss. And since the park was so big, these hunters sometimes spent days at a time living off the land while tracking down larger animals to bring home. All that activity makes them easy to track. But to our surprise, and aside from a few useless tracks that led into streams or onto hard ground, there was no sign of the bear man anywhere. Now, we decided to finish our search, as sunset was fast approaching, but since I most definitely believed the officer when he said he'd bring trouble for us if we didn't find him, we just resumed our search for the bear man the next morning, bright and early at dawn. Now, myself and a coworker headed further into the wilderness, leading on from what we believed were likely to be the bear man's tracks, but we couldn't know for certain. We crossed a few miles of meadows and streams, keeping our eyes on the ground for any sign of our bear man, but all we found were animal tracks, a few droppings, but nothing human. The man had no doubt gone deeper into the park, in which case we were traveling in the right direction, so to not find a single sign of him beyond what we'd already found was deeply unsettling. And after a while, myself and my partner started to believe that going any further was a waste of time. If we hadn't found any trace of the man, then we were in the wrong area. But then, right as we were about to turn back and return the Goat to HQ, we found the charms. Now, I don't know if charms is the right word here, but the word in Russian is obereg, and it means like trinkets that have a holy or spiritual power to them. Some are related to the church and consists of lengths of blessed rope that some tie around the necks of their dogs, but others are related to zagovori, or Slavic folk conjuring, and do not bring blessings, but only curses. And so, as you can imagine, it was a very unpleasant surprise to find that the ones we discovered that day were almost certainly of the second variety. The first one we found was hanging from a low branch and consisted of a small bird's skull with a backboard of woven twigs. Now, my partner pulled it from the tree and gave me a look. Such things were not strictly legal during communism. Zagovori wasn't against the law, but a man could expect some extensive psychiatric treatment, quote-unquote, if he was found to have faith in such ancient superstitions. We didn't take this as an indication that our bear man was a crazy person worshipping the old gods, but we certainly took it as a sign that he wasn't interested in respecting our authority as foresters. Now, having realized that we were closer than we first thought, we decided to push on into the forest. Then only after a short distance, we found more of what we could only assume was the bear man's charms. Not all of them included animal bones, only the most disturbing ones. But each and every one let us know that we were in this man's territory, some place he did not want us to be. There was still the question of if this man actually made the charms, but we had to assume it was him because the idea of 2 or more people running around with furs while making charms, that was just too unsettling for us to consider just yet. And since we had his territory roughly marked out, myself and my partner returned to HQ to report what we'd found. Now, our boss told us that he'd organize a wider search with a larger team for the next morning. And at dawn, we hiked alone to cover more ground, using radios to keep in touch with each other. But this proved to be a big mistake. At around mid-morning, one of our team was walking through the area that we'd explored the day before when suddenly, the very ground beneath his feet seemed to give way. At a pure instinct, the forester turned as he fell and tried as best as he could to propel himself away from the drop. This meant that he was able to hang on, but only barely before he used all of his might to drag himself to safety. Now, once he'd managed to find his feet, he turned around to inspect what he'd almost fallen into. And that's when he discovered a deep pit full of sharpened stakes. And there were 6 in total, and each was sharp enough to puncture a man's boot, should he have fallen with enough force. And since he was safe to do so, the team member called in what he'd found over his radio, and we all went rushing over to his position to check it out. And only then did we realize how serious the situation was. This bear man didn't simply mean to mark out his forest fiefdom. He was determined to wound or potentially even kill anyone who pursued him. And since we were not armed at the time, we retreated to our various HQs, either northern, central, or southern, and awaited further orders from our boss. Now, we were itching to find the man and have the police arrest him for almost snuffing out one of our team. And then when the time finally came to strike back, it came with fantastic news. The next time we went out looking for the bear man, we were told that we'd be equipped with rifles loaned from the local Red Army militia, like your Army Reserves kind of thing. And we were also ordered to travel in teams of 2 for safety, which was also music to our ears. And we thought this could keep us safe and that the sight of us with weapons might scare this bear man away, but we were wrong. Dead wrong. And just a few hours into the search, we received a frantic call over our radios from one of the 2-man teams. The caller sounded terrified as he explained that they were under attack from an unknown position. They couldn't see the attacker, but their attacker could see them, meaning they'd been forced to fall back at a rapid pace to avoid being hurt or killed. Now, we hadn't heard any gunfire, which was obviously very strange if these 2 men were under fire, but we also knew which sector the pair had been assigned, so we went running in their direction with our rifles ready. Now, we expected to hear gunfire on our approach, but we didn't. We only heard the sound of our 2 frightened coworkers running for their lives and yelling for us to help them. When they saw us, they began shouting about how he was behind them, and then they frantically began urging us to rake the area behind them with bullets because he was there, we just couldn't see him. They had clearly not been spooked by anything imaginary. Someone had most definitely given them a fight, but to us, it looked like they were running from ghosts. Now, the 2 men refused to come out of cover for a minute or two, saying that there had been arrows flying at us any second. Now, this is the point where we all asked them, "Arrows? Are you sure?" But we didn't need to take their word for it because after carefully retracing their steps, we found one of the arrows that had been shot at them buried in the trunk of a tree. Now, that incident with the arrows marked the end of our forester patrols. The boss refused to allow us to return to that area of the forest without a militia escort, the militia being the Soviet militarized police force here. They could bring their Kalashnikov and PKM machine guns with them, all fully automatic, unlike the SK rifles we used, which dated back to the Great Patriotic War. And a week later, and once they had assembled, we guided the 24-strong militia unit towards the bear man's territory, and then we hiked up and down the forest all day long in search of him. Seeing as we were a larger force, we were able to cover much more ground, but no arrows or bullets were fired, and we failed to discover the man's living arrangements. We thought that, since we didn't encounter him a second time, the bear man had most probably moved on, and this made a lot of sense to us as he'd seen us walking through his woods with rifles just a week or so prior. If the man really was confined to a simple bow and arrow, then we had him sorely outgunned, and it only made sense for him to flee while he still had his luck. But the man had not moved on. On the contrary, he simply waited to strike on his own terms. About a week after the militia helped us sweep the forest, 2 foresters staying in a northern sector cabin received a very frightening surprise in the middle of the night when they discovered that someone had snuck up to their cabin and set it on fire. Luckily, one of the foresters was awake and heard the glass bottle smash on the wood outside before the sudden burst of flames sent him rushing for the fire extinguisher. He tried his very best to douse the flames, but Those old Soviet military fire extinguishers that we had were next to useless, and he was unable to put out the fire. Both foresters managed to escape the burning cabin with their lives, but the incident marked a further escalation in this conflict. Instead of us going hunting for him, this bear man was now hunting us. And the boss had called the militia back into the forest, only that time they arrived with more than twice the numbers. Instead of just 24 men, they sent an entire company of militarized police to comb the bear man's territory, and that time, he didn't simply watch and wait for the policemen to corner him. He attacked. Chaos erupted around midday when one of the militia officers was shot with an arrow. Thankfully, it only punched through the meat of his shoulder and did not penetrate any internal organs. But we all heard the man's screams of agony echoing around the forest before a storm of gunfire commenced. The men accompanying the wounded officer opened fire into the woods, shooting everywhere and anywhere in the hopes of hitting their hidden attacker. When they finished, no more arrows came after their storm of gunfire, and following a search of the area, blood trails were found leading deeper into the forest. The militia tracked these blood trails with dogs, and after hours of marching deep into the woods, they finally found one of the man's living spaces, consisting of little more than a dugout that used pine branches for shelter. The blood trails had ceased long before then, presumably after the bear man tended to his wounds, but despite there being ample evidence of him residing there, he was nowhere to be found around his improvised living space. Now, that final militia patrol marked the end of our encounters with the bear man. There were no more arrows fired, no more charms found, not for a long time anyway. We thought the man had either succumbed to his wounds or decided to vacate the area entirely. And either way, we had dealt with a problem that could have easily resulted in one of us losing their lives, and so as you can imagine, we were very relieved to be able to focus on our jobs again. Now at this point, years have passed, and the Iron Curtain fell, and overnight we found that we didn't have jobs to even do anymore. Some had stuck around living off the land and off what little our old money could buy us, but then slowly and surely, one by one, foresters started leaving. Some for Moscow or Perm to find work, and others to foreign countries where they'd hoped to start a new life. I ended up being one of those men who left Russia for good, but during that process of getting a visa, packing up my things, and saying goodbye to family, I often wondered if I was doing the right thing or not. But do you know what happened to make me realize that I was doing the right thing? It was when I heard from an old coworker, still living in and working in Yugoslavia, that on a routine tree count, another one of the bear man's charms had been found. Only this one looked brand new. And I've never looked back, not because I don't miss Russia, which I do a lot sometimes. It's because there was never just one wild man wearing his bear's head, hoping to kill or wound foresters. There were more, perhaps even a lot more. And it felt like it was only a matter of time before that same bloody struggle played out all over again. My name is Ion, and I'm a forester here in Romania. I lived in a small village very close to the forest, and every morning after waking up early, I put on my uniform and I head out into the forest. And my job is really quite simple. Just like my colleagues, I walk many kilometers every day to check the trees. We mark old or sick ones to be cut legally, and then we count the number of young trees and plant new ones in the spring. Now, we keep our eyes peeled for bears and wolves or lynx, because they too must be monitored and counted just like the trees. But one of our most common activities is stopping cars and trucks to check their papers and check for illegal wood. Because without a doubt, the single biggest problem that we have here is illegal logging. Now, they mostly come at night with axes and chainsaws, and then cut down the best and oldest trees, either beech, oak, or spruce, and then haul them away as fast as they can. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how many trees can these people cut down? It can't be many. Well, sometimes the larger gangs can cut down to 100 trees per night, and they do this night after night, taking very few nights off, so in that space of about a month, we can lose thousands upon thousands of healthy, old-growth trees. Now, many of the foresters, the less reputable ones, take bribes from the loggers. The rest of us are intimidated with their axe and chainsaws, and sometimes they even carry guns, something we ourselves were not allowed to carry until 2019, at which point it was too late to stop this story's events from unfolding. Illegal logging is very damaging to the forests, and not just in the ways that you might assume. Without the trees, the soil washes away when it rains. This muddies rivers, causes them to burst their banks, and they flood villages to cause devastating and sometimes lasting damage to people's lives. Logging also frightens the animals, who either flee their habitats or are killed as their nests or dens come crashing down, or are crushed by those same falling trees. And I fear that if we lose our beautiful places, my children will not get to see the big old forest that I saw when I was young. And that thought breaks my heart, but it also gives us the will to fight them. And it's just that. This fight has required many sacrifices, not just in time and effort, but in blood. And for a long time, we used to hide in the forest at night with a notebook and a flashlight. If the group of illegal loggers was large enough, we would simply hide in the darkness, take notes on their numbers. However, if the group is small enough, we can sometimes trick them into thinking that we are more in numbers, at which point they will abandon their lumber, jump into their trucks, and drive away. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes the loggers go on the attack and will rush us with their chainsaws and axes at the ready. And believe me, you have not seen your life flash before your eyes like you will when a man with a revving chainsaw is running at you full speed. It's a horror that I'm never likely to forget. Now, we call the police when this happens, but they are stationed far from the forest and only ever arrive too late to do anything about the loggers. Now, for the most part, us foresters tried our best to stop the logging, and we also tried to root out those of us who have been taking bribes. We tried very hard, but we were mostly unsuccessful in this. And in the end, the government decided to tar us all with the same brush. So one day our boss summoned us all to the headquarters because he'd had an announcement to make. The local government had gotten sick of us failing to adequately deal with the problems of the loggers, and after learning of a few isolated cases of foresters taking bribes, they decided that we all had been corrupt. Our protests fell on deaf ears as the government had already decided what they were going to do. If we weren't going to root out those taking bribes, then we would all have to pay for the lost lumber. Thousands of liu, our national currency, would be taken from our collective paychecks every single week, and the longer we failed to deal with the problem, the longer the deductions would continue. We were furious, absolutely furious, but this was also at a time when we had but two options to choose from: work as agreed and lose out on pay, or quit and face the possibility of not being able to put food on our families' tables. And for some of the younger foresters, it was a tough choice. But for those of us with families, we had only one option: ramp up our efforts to rid the forest of those loggers, no matter what the physical or spiritual cost. And at this stage, we were still not permitted to carry guns around the park, so we had to think creatively to scare off the loggers. And at first we used firecrackers, very large and powerful ones that we could launch through the trees from a distance. These would explode over the loggers' heads and terrified them when they were working in the darkness. But then after a while, they learned not to be bothered by them and would just carry on until we ran out of fireworks to launch. And after that, we tried bringing dogs to scare the loggers, but they called our bluff as we weren't willing to risk the safety of our loyal furried friends, so we didn't sick them on the loggers anymore. And all the while, we petitioned the government to allow us to carry guns with which to defend ourselves, but at each turn, we were told the same thing over and over: you're not soldiers, you're not police, and it's too dangerous. In the end, we were told to focus on intel gathering in the hopes that we would turn over what we found to the police and have them arrest the loggers in their homes. But this was a very slow process, and as we began to lose money, we began taking risks. For months, we found ourselves fighting a losing battle, and then finally a small victory gave us a massive boost of morale. Two of the foresters, Niku and Gavril, were out on patrol one night when they found a group of loggers. There were a lot of them and only 2 of our foresters, but then instead of simply observing them and taking notes, Niku and Gavril hatched a plan. And this was at a time when, if one lone forester confronted the loggers would just simply chase them away with their axes and chainsaws. And so when Niku began shouting at them and walking straight over to them with his flashlight switched on, some of the loggers stopped their cutting and began walking towards him. And there was shouting of all kinds of curses, making a big scene, and although not all of the loggers went to chase Niku away, it caused enough of a scene to draw the attention of those who remained behind. Meaning no one saw Gavel sneak up to their truck and stab holes in 3 of its 4 tires. No one saw him sneaking up, and no one saw him sneaking away. And then the next morning, a second pair of foresters found the illegal logger's truck abandoned with those 3 flat tires. We were elated, and we celebrated the abandoned truck like we had just won a battle in some great war. We were able to sell the illegally harvested lumber to recoup the forest's losses and plant many new trees, and we also had a new and effective way of fighting the loggers, and that brought our spirits up an incredible amount. But sadly, it didn't even last a month, because just a few weeks later, little Pavel was out patrolling on his own in a section of forest that we didn't think was of any interest to the loggers, and we found out that we were wrong. It was the middle of the night when we got a call from Pavel saying that the loggers were trying to outsmart us by logging where we didn't expect them to. He said there were lots of them too, 2 trucks worth, so he needed backup to try and scare them off or distract them enough to get a knife into the truck's tires. Those of us that were on duty and could access a vehicle rushed to Pavel's aid. We were hopeful, knowing that we could stop those loggers if we could only get a man near the trucks. But then as we all rushed to Pavel's position, he started talking over his radio again. He said the trucks had almost finished loading up and that the loggers were preparing to leave. We told him not to do anything alone, but after that, he stopped responding on his radio. I panicked, and so did everyone else who heard the radio so quiet. Then, when I arrived at the scene, only my fellow foresters were present and the loggers had disappeared entirely. But to our worry, so had Pavel. And we spent the rest of the night searching for him, walking in pairs with our flashlights and calling out his name. We searched for miles around, but when daylight finally came, he turned out to be no more than 100 yards from where we were first standing. We all knew that he had been found, and we all knew the search had come to an end, because we heard a man screaming like his sanity was slipping away. He had found Pavel, and they had chopped and sawed him to pieces. It was without a doubt the worst crime I had ever had the misfortune of laying eyes on, and in my time as a forester, I had seen a number of very grisly murders and very gory accidents, but not one of them, not even the prostitute who was found broken in half and shoved into the cavity of a tree, managed to horrify me as much as seeing Pavel in pieces. It affected everyone terribly, and many of us went to Pavel's funeral to console his mother with how brave he'd been. I wouldn't say his sacrifice was worth it, because we should have been given weapons long before Pavel lost his life, but his death prompted our bosses to enter into serious talks with local politicians who relented and allowed us to carry rifles. We're not allowed to open fire unless we're directly threatened, but seeing us with rifles was all it took to scare the loggers into going someplace else. We put a brass plaque up at the HQ to honor Pavel's sacrifice, and it's a reminder to new foresters that they are lucky to be a part of a new generation who are allowed to defend themselves. We still face danger, and illegal logging hasn't stopped entirely, but now, no one will ever suffer the same fate as poor Pavel, who died while protecting the forest from human greed. I've worked for the Forest Service for the past 15 years or so, and it's a job that comes with a set of pretty unique challenges in terms of law enforcement. And one of the biggest problems we face is that of illegal hunting. And no matter how flexible we are, and no matter how much prior warning we give the local hunting community, there are still those who seek to bypass the law in order to bag themselves a buck at a season. It's probably one of the most infuriating things we deal with too, Because if everyone acted like the out-of-season hunters, there'd be far fewer deer and other animals to hunt in season, and it might well contribute to a population spiral among the local fauna. And they acted like the rules shouldn't apply to them, and they give you the worst excuses. Like one guy swore on all he held dear that he thought it was still September. I mean, he'd have to be a moron to forget what month it was, and he'd have to have pegged me for even more of an idiot to believe an excuse like that. Needless to say, we take illegal hunting very seriously. So when we get reports that they're operating out there, putting the animal population in danger, you can bet your bottom dollar that we act on them. So one day, when I got word that some illegal hunting might have been taking place in a particular area of the forest, I drove over immediately to check it out. Now, one of the techniques we use to identify illegal hunting is examining tree trunks in the suspect area. Now, be it a fresh scar in the bark, a small puncture buried beneath new growth, or the piece of metal detected just under the surface, there are many ways to tell if a rifle or shotgun had recently been fired in a certain location. A bullet lodged at a certain height can tell investigators not only where a hunter stood when taking a shot, but also the direction the shot was fired, and we can also use the frequency of said damage to determine if it's a place poachers use as a regular spot. If the trajectory of the shot lines up with the habitat of a protected species, it might even help officers build a case involving the killing of said protected species. And in light of that, us rangers sometimes use metal detectors to locate lead or steel hidden beneath a tree's bark, or, in serious cases, bullets may be removed for ballistic testing. A cartridge dug out of a tree can link a crime scene to a specific firearm just as it might in traditional criminal investigation. Logging companies also have a large vested interest in this because when their saws hit metal buried in wood, the blades can be ruined and operators can be severely wounded, sometimes even killed. In fact, a lot of the reports that we get come from sawmills, who alert the authorities to places where gunfire into trees happens frequently. In this way, trees can serve as a sort of silent witness. Long after an illegal shot had been fired, the evidence may still be lodged there, right inside the wood. So, after getting the report and driving over to the area in question, I grabbed a handheld metal detector from my truck and then went walking through the trees looking for any sign of gunshot damage. Sometimes buckshot damage looks like scratching from deer antlers, which they do remove velvet and mark territory, so sometimes you'll run the detector over a suspected patch of bark only to get nothing. But then after walking for maybe half a mile, I saw some pretty glaring evidence of shotgun damage to a tree. Now, it was a clear example of buckshot damage, one of the clearest I'd ever seen, so I had no doubt whatsoever what had caused the damage. But when I ran the detector over the stop, it just stayed silent. This was obviously very confusing because even the smartest illegal hunter doesn't bother to go digging into tree trunks to retrieve tiny pieces of metal, and from what I could tell from the naked eye, there was a lot of it stuck in that tree. So much so that it might have even come from multiple shots. I pulled out the small knife that I carry with me at times and then started to carefully pull away some of the bark around the affected area. Now once again, it was quite clearly some ballistic damage because of the obvious tunneling, but when I got to the bottom of one tunnel, it wasn't a fragment of dull metal that I saw, but a kind of off-white, almost porcelain-looking substance. I'd never seen anything like it in my life, and I've been working for the Forest Service for almost 10 years by that point, so naturally, I was very focused to get to the bottom of it. I used my knife to scrape away some of the wood so I could dislodge the small off-white clump, but then after very carefully extracting it from the tree and examining it up close, I was so shocked that I remember letting out a gasp as I almost dropped it. It wasn't a piece of buckshot. It wasn't a bullet. It was a tooth, and from what I could tell, it was a human tooth. As a ranger, you learn to identify the teeth and or bones of all the various animals that call the park home. Birds are probably the easiest to identify, and then deer teeth are pretty easy seeing as how flat they are. And the same applies to carnivore teeth too, as their distinct shape makes them very easy to identify. And so when I pulled what was quite clearly a front tooth out of that tree, there was no doubt in my mind that it was holding a person's tooth, and not an animal's. Now, we might be forest rangers, but we're still law enforcement, and we're charged with all of the same duties as regular police officers. So when I found that tooth, my first thought following the initial shock was, I need to preserve the rest of the evidence. I walked back to my truck, called in what I'd found over the radio, and then made my way back to the damaged tree to string a bunch of crime scene tape around the surrounding undamaged trees. One of my coworkers was on scene within the hour, and when I showed them what I'd found, they also admitted to finding it incredibly scary. We also felt kind of powerless because I'd say 90% of stuff that goes on in the forest stays in-house, so to speak, as in we deal with it ourselves. But something as bizarre and unexpected as teeth being buried in a tree would require a team of crime scene technicians, possibly even a forensic anthropologist, since we didn't even know how old they were and how long they'd been stuck in that tree. Now, it took days before a full team was assembled. But then one morning, right at the break of dawn, a whole team of techs and forensic guys and a photographer were all headed towards the taped-up area. Everything was photographed. The tree, the ground around it, and positioning of the damage, as well as a close-up to show the teeth still lodged in the trunk. Only when all that was done did they actually go about removing the rest of the teeth from the tree, and they only did so using tools meant to preserve even the smallest trace of DNA or residue. The team also took samples of the wood too, because the rate of growth can help determine how long the teeth have been there. My coworker and I stood there watching them all morning and then offering any information that they might find useful. The investigators seemed particularly interested in there being any unusual activity in recent weeks, and we said if there had been any, we sure hadn't spotted it. And then after that, it was up to the lab to do their tests, so all we could do was wait patiently to hear back. Obviously, our number one question involved who the teeth belonged to, and so did the lab. And so the very first thing we did was compare them to the dental records of those on the National Missing Persons Registry. Now, unfortunately, they didn't get a match, but they were able to quickly move on to DNA testing, which everyone believed would be more likely to bring up a match. DNA testing doesn't just tell you who something belongs to, it tells who their relatives are too. So even if the lab didn't get a direct match, there was a chance that we'd be able to contact who could fill us in on the whole picture. But there were no matches, none whatsoever. Whoever's teeth were in that tree had no relatives on that system, living or dead. And while that's not entirely out of the question, it was another deeply unsettling little detail that we had to contend with. In the end, we never did find out exactly how those teeth ended up in that tree. All we got were just a list of likely theories. One that's worth mentioning, although it turned out to be false, was the idea one of my coworkers had. He figured that it might be some kind of Native American burial site, so old that a tree actually grew up and brought some of this guy's teeth with it. Now, I mean, there was obviously a chance of foul play and that some poor soul had taken a shotgun blast at close range or something, but if that was the case, there would have been shotgun fragments buried along with it. And as one coworker said, it was almost like someone had loaded up a shotgun shell with human teeth and then just fired them at the tree. Now, this was the one scenario, no matter how unlikely, creeped the ever-living crap out of us thinking about it. In fact, just about the only comfort that we had was the idea that those teeth were old, really old, and that if their owners had suffered at all, at least it hadn't been recent. Something we maybe could have done something about and failed to. But just about the only conclusive thing the lab brought back to us was that the teeth appeared to have been buried in that tree trunk for just over a year at maximum, and that they belonged to a man in his 40s at the time of presumably death. Now that was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that I'd actually been working as a ranger around the time of such a thing happening. The forest is a big place too, and by comparison, our ranger team is little more than a skeleton crew, so it's impossible for us to be everywhere at once. But still, it's a bitter pill to swallow. And they never did find out who those teeth belonged to, and no one could say for sure that it was murder, or that his teeth had ended up in that tree some other way. Now, I try not to think about it because when I did, it made walking among those trees all the more creepier. And even now that I'm retired, I still think about those teeth every so often and wonder how in the world they ended up deep in that tree. I've been a U.S. Forest Ranger for the better part of 3 decades, and in that time, I've heard some mighty tall tales from various hikers and campers. We've had more Bigfoot sightings than I can count, about 20-something UFO encounters, and one guy even swore that he saw Jimmy Hoffa, the union boss who disappeared, hiding out in the Barrens and living in an RV. It's not just the reports we receive either, because when certain people find out that I'm a ranger, they sometimes ask me about strange or unexplained encounters that I might have experienced while on duty. I appreciate the question, it's a lot more exciting than the stuff I'm usually asked, but unfortunately, my answers tend to disappoint them. I've never seen any kind of undocumented animals out here, nor have I seen any strange lights hovering in the sky, and the only hairy bipedal growling monsters I've seen stomping through the woods have been my coworkers during early mornings. The only thing that's ever happened that's left me truly disturbed doesn't even make for a good story, I don't think. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, or an end. It was all just confusion, fear, and unanswered questions, and it started when a ranger named Ron went missing while out on patrol. It was a regular morning, and Ron was out performing a fire management inspection when he suddenly stopped responding to radio calls. A ranger drove out to his last known location where he found Ron's truck abandoned and his radio sitting on the passenger seat. A brief search of the area surrounding the truck yielded nothing, so by that late evening, we had state search and rescue guys out there, walking the woods with their sniffing dogs. And it turned out to be a relatively simple process of letting the dogs lead us to him, and after letting them sniff around Ron's truck for a little bit, we expected Ron to be injured in some way, as there were few other reasons why he'd just drop out of contact like that. But when we found him, it was way worse than we thought. Ron was cold, and he looked to be suffering some kind of allergic reaction. I had a cousin that was allergic to peanuts, and Ron looked and sounded exactly like my cousin did when he accidentally ate something with peanut brittle in it one Halloween. Only, it wasn't just Ron's face and neck that looked incredibly swollen. It was his arms and hands, too. They were this sort of deep pink, and the skin was so stretched and taut that it looked almost shiny. The same reddy pink discoloration was consistent all along his arms and hands, but around his fingertips, the skin had become so dark it was almost black. Now, we had a medic with us, so she rushed into action as soon as we found him. She cleared Ron's airway, put an IV in his arm, and then an ATV with a transport cot showed up to take him back to the headquarters. And from there, he was airlifted to a hospital, and by the time he was in that chopper being lifted up into the air, we were a mess. We had no idea what had happened to him out there, and what he'd done or what he'd found. Instead, just about the only thing we did know was that there was a good chance Ron wasn't going to make it. The medics who treated him looked panicked as they tried to figure out what was wrong with him, and one of them even told us straight that it wasn't looking good for him. One of the rangers, a lady named Susie, was in tears by the time we sat down in HQ again. We thought about Ron's wife and kids and how worried they must be, and it just tore us up. Over the next few days, we stayed in almost constant contact with the hospital, awaiting word of any change at all in Ron's condition. Then thankfully, our prayers were answered, and around 72 hours after he was admitted, doctors announced that he'd been stabilized and that he'd most likely pull through. A few of us went to pay him a visit and found his wife in a chair at his bedside. We were obviously very happy to see him awake and alert, so it made for an emotional reunion, but there was an elephant in the room. A very large one, too, because each of us were desperately wanting to know what the hell had happened to him. And when we asked, we were incredibly frustrated to hear that, essentially, Ron couldn't really remember what had happened to him. He remembers walking through the woods, looking for buildups of dead wood or dry pine needles when he suddenly spotted what looked to be a piece of black volcanic rock lying on the ground. It looked very out of place in a forest with no major deposits of that kind of stuff, and so assuming it had been dropped by a hiker, Ron walked over to it and picked it up. He said nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. It felt kind of light, much like a lot of volcanic rocks, but then as he was walking with it, it started to feel very warm in his hands. This was one of the last things he remembered, as he dropped the rock, knowing that whatever was happening, it probably wasn't good for him. And he then said that looking at it just lying there on the ground was when his memory started to get very hazy. He remembered the swelling feeling and he remembered not being able to breathe properly, but after that, there was just darkness until he woke up in a hospital bed with all those tubes sticking out of him. Now, after a couple of their agents came to talk to him, Ron directed the EPA towards where he'd been patrolling, and they sent a couple of guys over to look for the rock he'd found. At first, doctors were afraid that it had been radioactive and that Ron was suffering from some kind of acute radiation sickness. They were able to rule that out very quickly thanks to the technology they had at hand, but that only allowed them to rule out one of many possible explanations, and in order to save his life, they needed that list to get much shorter, much quicker. The medical team tried everything, but only managed to reduce the severity of Ron's condition and not alleviate it entirely, and that at some point, right around hour 60, Ron's condition began to stabilize, seemingly on its own, after which his prognosis improved dramatically. And by the time we visited, the doctors were safely able to rule out any kind of allergic reaction. But obviously they wouldn't be able to figure out exactly what had happened to Ron until the EPA was able to recover the rock that he'd touched. Only, this is where things get weird because the EPA guy couldn't find any trace of any such a volcanic rock anywhere. Now, they walked over the grid squares that Ron had given them, and this was solid info because we had a digital record of where he'd been headed that morning. But after combing through the undergrowth with a fine-toothed comb for hours and hours on end, they didn't manage to find a single piece of rock fitting the description that Ron had given them. They obviously didn't want a hazardous or toxic substance getting into someone else's hand, so they tried their damnedest to find it. But they couldn't, and that scared us. Having something like that around the forest quite obviously posed a danger to the public. Now, we tried our best to warn visitors not to pick up any strange rocks and to report anything unusual directly to the Forest Service office. We were terrified the same thing would happen to a curious hiker or, God forbid, a child. But nothing ever did, and it was like that little piece of warm rock had just disappeared from the face of the earth. And without it, there was no way that we'd ever definitively find out what had happened to Ron. Ron did get better, but he never did come back to work, and he ended up getting a job working with his brother in some home renovations. It was good money, but Ron loved being a ranger, so we knew something really must have frightened him to want to throw in the towel altogether. I can't say it's kept me up at night. It's all long in the past, but I still sometimes catch myself wondering just what the hell he found out there. 2020 was a really tough year. A lot of good folks lost their job. Some lost their minds too, I guess, and we all had trouble getting our hands on the stuff we needed. Well, the same was true for a lot of bad people too, myself included. As a functioning opioid addict at the time of the pandemic, supply chain issues and general anxiety made it much harder than usual to get a clean fix. It also made it way harder for me to make money since the restaurant I worked at was closed for weeks at a time. My stimulus check didn't last long, and then after a few weeks of burning through my emergency fund, I was starting to get a little worried. Not only that, but the number of dealers going temporarily offline for the lockdowns was getting higher and higher, which in turn drove up the price of everything. I needed a money-making scheme and fast, so I tried all kinds of things, including setting up a .onion domain. Now, a .onion domain is basically a website on the dark web. Now, I can hear all you nerds howling, actually, already, but that's basically what it is, and to be honest, it was a little more than a joke to start with. Now, I wanted to learn how to set up a tour site anyways, so what I uploaded ended up just being somewhere between a joke and a Hail Mary, and I worked pretty hard on it, and when it went live, I felt pretty damned proud of it. And then plastered at the top of the page was the site's title and concept, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, or 5D for short. Now, it was a reference to one of my all-time favorite AC/DC songs, and I figured it was the perfect way to sell a very specific set of services to the people of East Texas and Western Louisiana. Now, see, I might have been a scumbag drug addict, but I was also something of an adrenaline junkie, too. I wasn't out to walk old ladies' dogs or help people move apartments. I wanted to do something exciting, something to liven up lockdown, so I offered people a chance to get revenge. Whether it was a bitter ex or some a-hole boss, I was offering to pull a mean prank on them for a pre-arranged price. Clients paid half before the job and half after, on pain of their victim finding out exactly who paid for the prank to be pulled. I didn't think it would get much traction. I mean, it's not like it was a surface layer website that'd show up on Google if I paid them a few bucks a month. A person needed a Tor browser to get access to 5D, and normies don't use Tor. But then one day, I checked the site's email address on a total whim and was surprised to find a job request in its inbox. Now, the message was from an anonymous user, as they all were, who said their ex-boyfriend was an abusive a-hole who needed to be taken down a peg. Now, I offered to shove a bunch of sardines into the vent of his car and explained how they'd be stinking to high heaven after just a day or two in the summer heat. Now, she thought that was a good idea, transferred me half that Bitcoin, and then that night, I drove over to the address that I'd been given where I did the dirty deed. Now, I then took photographic evidence and then received the second half of the payment once I'd driven back home. Now, the girl seemed real happy with the end result, and so she was only too happy to pay. And then when I told her to recommend me to a friend, she actually did, and I got my second job just a couple of days later. Those first two jobs were the only ones that I had for like 3 months, but when the second stay-at-home order was issued by Greg Abbott, I guess more and more people decided to screw around on the dark web, but slowly and surely, business started to pick up. Now, I smeared a bunch of dog crap on some guy's front door handle, apparently because he stiffed a client out of overtime pay. I then plastered this lady's house in a bologna mosaic because the acid in cheap bologna etches clear coat in the sun and ruins a paint job. And I was told that she gave a kid a bad grade for some petty personal reason, but I didn't care, as long as the Bitcoin arrived in my wallet. Now, I even rolled a bunch of glitter onto a driveway, and sprayed a bunch of herbicide onto a lawn so it spelled out a curse word, and I once painted a house with pure fish emulsion at night. It seeps into whatever it touches and makes a place smell like low tide mixed with death for like 6 weeks. And as you can tell, I became something of an artist when it came to pulling especially mean pranks. And then with all the photographic evidence that I was uploading to the site, visitors were able to see how serious and effective I was, and that generated a lot of business. Things started fairly light, shall we say, with my mainstay being mean revenge pranks. But then as time went on, the job started to get a little more sinister. And one time a user asked me to take a package from a deserted pickup point to a deserted dead drop, and I knew it was probably drugs or something, maybe a hot pistol wrapped up tight in a t-shirt and taped up. But the price was right, and so the job was done, and I used to get similar or identical jobs maybe once or twice a week too, so those were my big earners for a while. But then came stuff that really started to push my limit. One time I was instructed to pick up a thumb drive from this dead drop, and then I had to take it to some dude over in Kilgore who either put something on it or copied something from it before taking it back to the dead drop. I don't know what the heck was on that thumb drive, and neither do I want to, but from the look of the dude that I dealt with, whatever it was very, very nasty. And that was the first time that I got home from a job and figured that I should probably be a little bit more choosy when it came to the jobs I took. I wasn't even desperate for cash by then either, because the restaurant had opened again and I was getting shifts. Now, I wasn't going to do it for money anymore. I was kind of just doing it for kicks. I did a few more jobs, nothing too sinister, but I was really starting to notice the change in clientele. I was getting fewer and fewer jobs that could be described as harmless pranks, and more that, like those others, made me feel sick to my stomach once they were over and done with. I'd already decided to close the site when that last request came in, but as you'll soon see, I had no choice but to entertain it when I saw how much money they were talking. And so by this stage, I was checking 5D's email only once or twice a week instead of every day. I was mostly just skimming the emails, turning my nose up to all the weirder requests that were most likely way more illegal than just making someone's car smell like anchovies. But then, I saw this one request. one which promised me way more money than I'd ever been paid before. I charged a couple of $100 for more basic jobs, a couple of $1,000 for much more complex or costly ones like the fish one, but this one was offering me $10,000 for a single night's work. Now, I emailed them back, saying if the job involved physically hurting anyone, I wasn't interested, and they replied saying that I wouldn't have to hurt anyone, but that the job might require coercion and possibly some physical force too. But for 10 grand, I was more than willing to get a little handsy with someone if I could guarantee a clean getaway. And only then did I ask what they needed, and only then did they drop the bombshell on me. They wanted me to kidnap someone. Now obviously I had questions, and the first one was, who? Now I wasn't expecting the answer they gave me, and not because of the name they gave me either, very much the opposite. You see, they didn't give me a name. They just told me, anybody. And once they told me the job was to kidnap literally any female, preferably an adult, but a child would do, I was thinking, no way, dude. This is either a prank or a fed. But then they lost me altogether by claiming that they were part of some big, shadowy organization that liked to partake in, of all things, live cannibalism. That's not just regular old cannibalism either, people. Like the kind that kept the Donner Party going. Live cannibalism involves amputating parts of your victim while they're still alive, and then cooking and consuming said parts while the victim is forced to watch. I called the guy out, told him I didn't believe a word of that, and said that he wouldn't be hearing from me again. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is when they sent me their X-Pub. Now, without getting too technical, if you put someone's X-Pub, Y-Pub, or Z-Pub into an extended public address in a blockchain explorer, you see their total crypto balance for any given wallet. It's not a particularly smart thing to show a stranger because you can see this person's transaction history too, not just the amount of crypto they've accrued. But this is how I realized this guy wasn't some bullcrapper and wasn't some edgy 15-year-old doing it for the lulz. The guy had $500,000 worth of Bitcoin, and his transaction history showed evidence of major traffic. He was 100% legit. Bitcoin was moving in and out of that wallet every single day, and some of the transactions were way higher than just 10K. It was probably the strongest evidence this guy could have possibly presented to me to prove that he was legitimate, and so as you can imagine, I was pretty stunned. But I wasn't horrified. Not yet. Just because the guy had a ton of Bitcoin at hand didn't mean it wasn't a prank. But instead of dismissing my concerns, this guy made every effort to address them. They wouldn't give me any details regarding their organization, only that they existed. But on the off chance any of the girls' remains were found and a murder investigation was opened, they also didn't want anyone who'd freak out and go to the cops. They wanted someone who could live with themselves, having sold a human life for just a few $1,000s, and I guess they figured that person was me. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. As I ended up talking to this anonymous and apparently very wealthy user from around 11 at night to 3:30 in the morning, talking methods, techniques, and logistics. They had a drop-off location lined up and claimed that they could guarantee the site's security, but they also offered help in planning the actual kidnap and offered me a bunch of advice on how to coerce, intimidate, and overpower my potential victim. I actually typed out a bunch of it, but it's probably not very YouTube-friendly to be talking about that kind of stuff in videos. Specific stuff, I mean, so I'll just skip over the particulars of what I was told. But needless to say, it was detailed, it was extensive, and it was disturbing, and to me, it was yet more proof that this person was not just some prankster with a dark sense of humor. They were for real. I suppose now's a good time to make it clear that I had no intention whatsoever of actually going through with the job. As in, from the moment the word kidnap appeared on screen, I was out. And then after a certain point, every single question I asked and every piece of information I extracted was purely for the benefit of law enforcement. I didn't even confirm the job with the client, I just confirmed my interest and said that I'd get back to him within 24 hours. but not even 2 hours of those had passed before I had taken 5D offline. I was exhausted afterwards and I desperately needed to get to sleep, but I couldn't, and instead, I headed out to a payphone while it was still dark. I used a text-to-speech program on my phone to relay everything I'd been told to a police dispatcher, including the address of the drop-off point, which I'm assuming was the most useful to them, seeing as someone's name had to be tied to the deed. Now, what kept me awake, what pushed me to report what had happened rather than the 8 hours of sleep I needed, was something the anonymous user had said after I told them I wasn't interested. They told me it was 5 figures for one night's work, that it was worth my time and I wouldn't get caught if I only did it right. But once again, I just said not interested. In response, the guy then says, and this isn't verbatim, but I'll summarize, "If you won't do it, we'll find someone who will." Now, this was before I'd seen the guy's Bitcoin wallet, so the words didn't land as intended until after I'd seen it, but once I had, it changed everything. I mean, I still wasn't 100% sure that what had happened was for real, because you can never really be sure of strangers you meet online until you truly know them. But although I was creeped out enough to report it, I wasn't convinced that I'd heard anything about it, as like any sort of arrests or trials or anything of that nature. But then one day, I did. So this was in September, and I was just sort of mindlessly scrolling when I spotted a headline about a guy from Texas. And seeing as it was local news, the headline grabbed my attention right away, but what I read made my jaw drop. A man had just been convicted of soliciting murder and cannibalism on the internet, and his name was Alex Barter. Long story short, Barter ended up talking to an undercover cop online, and from what I read, he gave them pretty much the same speech that I'd been given by the anonymous user. The undercover cop was offered cash to procure a kidnap victim, and just like in my case, the person was open and honest about the fate awaiting the victim. And there was nothing in any of the articles about the Bitcoin wallet that I'd seen, and there was also minor deviations in what the cop appeared to have been told. But while it all sounded very familiar, seeing a picture of Barter was confusing to say the least. If you Google image search this guy's picture, you'll agree that I'm being very generous when I say that he hardly looks like a criminal mastermind. He was only 23 when he was convicted, and he was apparently acting alone. But Barter was first arrested in 2018, and it just took till 2020 to sentence him. So if that was the case, then who the heck had I been talking to if Barter had been acting alone? And that's what makes me think that there really is some kind of network of people out there. Maybe they're not quite the criminal geniuses they like to think they are, but they've got money, and by the looks of things, they've got people too. Maybe they're better described as fall guys or pawns if you're feeling fancy, but they got people out there doing the legwork for them to keep the rich guys' hands from getting dirty. And I think I encountered one of them, and to this day, it scares the crap out of me how people like that exist. There will be more of them too, and just like they told me, it's only a matter of time before they find someone willing to work with them. And that little factoid is something that still keeps me up at night, even all these years later. My name is Max, and I grew up in Germany, and for as long as I have lived, I have tried to live a good life. I obeyed my mother and father, and I worked hard in school and university, and then I ambitiously and meticulously prepared myself for a career at one of Germany's most elite manufacturing companies. I was ambitious, aggressively so, and I can't deny that, but I was never arrogant and always remained ethical and humble in all my dealings with others. I donated a portion of my salary to charity and even a portion of my time to a local deaf charity. And while I admit to doing this to bolster my own self of well-being, that came part and parcel with living a life of good works and community service. But it was still not enough to keep me out of trouble. By the age of 32, in 2010, I hadn't been involved in any sort of violent altercation since a schoolyard shoving match during a game of football. And I lived a simple, happy life, having married in 2008, and by 2010, we had decided to start trying for a baby. It was a happy and exciting period in my life, probably the happiest and most exciting I'd ever known, but it was exhausting too. I'm not trying to make a crude joke, I just simply mean that my wife and I began planning like crazy, picking out design plans and furniture for our upcoming nursery. Now, it was a lot to think about, and I ended up losing more than a few hours of sleep over it. But it wasn't just the prospect of becoming a first-time father that was keeping me up, because I'd also put my name in for a promotion at work. A position had opened up following the resignation of a colleague. It was essentially an assistant director's role for my division of the office, so while I wouldn't be in charge, I'd have dominion over my former coworkers. And almost everyone put their name forward for the role, and I was open with my colleagues about doing the same. Everyone wished each other luck, and I believed everyone had the attitude of let the best man win. But as I came to learn, that was not entirely the case. I remember the day that a colleague in another department gave me the good news. We had all interviewed for the position, but management had not yet decided who the best candidate had been, and so we were all still waiting to hear back from them when an old friend of mine pulled me aside. He was dating one of the bigwig secretaries, this girl named Clara who had access to the executive lounge, and it was there that she had heard a member of management explaining how strongly I'd interviewed and how I'd entered a final pool of just 4 potential candidates. And as you can imagine, this was fantastic news which made me very happy, and I rode that wave of excitement all day long. But when it came time to finish work and head home, I remember feeling the exhaustion starting to get to me. By the time I climbed into my car seat and slid the keys into the ignition, I actually considered napping for a little bit of an hour so I had the energy to drive home, but I decided against it. Then, and only then, did I fasten my seatbelt and check my rear view to see if anyone was behind me. And if I'd chosen to do so any later, I might presently be dead, because when I looked up, occupying one portion of my rear view was a masked man. I believed him to be a car thief or a carjacker, I suppose you might say, so I quickly locked my doors and turned on my engine, intent on driving away. And yet the moment I turned the key, I heard the first shot. My windshield shattered along with the back windows, and I instinctively lowered myself down in my seat. If I hadn't, I'd be dead right now, as a police officer told me one of the bullets traveled directly through the headrest where my skull had just been moments before. I was able to drive quite easily, but I was so panicked that I almost crashed into the adjacent row of cars as I turned out of the parking lot and into the open corridor. I don't know exactly when the gunman stopped shooting. I was too focused on my escape, so I didn't slide up in my seat and resume a regular driving position until I was out on the street again, and fleeing as fast as my car would travel. I'm not sure exactly how long I drove for, but I did so very quickly. It occurred to me that I might get pulled over by the police, but I decided I didn't care. It would save me waiting for them in the parking lot of the fast food restaurant, which is where I ended up calling them from after nearly getting into several accidents while driving. The police officer was there within just a few minutes, and after explaining what had happened to her, she calmly offered me a ride to the police station so I could give a longer and much more detailed statement. My car wasn't roadworthy anymore, so I was given a ride back home where I explained to my very tearful wife that someone had just tried to murder me for no apparent reason whatsoever. It was a terrible time for both of us, but for weeks I believed that I had been almost the victim of a very aggressive carjacker and nothing more. But I was wrong. The police found the man who tried to shoot me, and at first I was amazed. I had a lot of faith in the federal police force, but the speed at which they apprehended the man was impressive nonetheless. Once again, I expected his motive to either be greed or addiction, as in he wanted my vehicle. But while greed was indeed a factor, it was not my vehicle that the man wanted. He wanted my life. And after the police tracked him down and arrested him, the man chose to cooperate in exchange for a more lenient sentence, and what he told the police was truly shocking to me. He'd been hired to kill me after discovering that there was a bounty on my head, and he discovered this on a sort of invisible website accessible to only certain people who knew how to find it. The investigator used the English language term dark web when I spoke to him, but the significance of this was lost on me for quite some time until I heard about other people being targeted in similar contract killings. The man confessed to having been hired by an anonymous source and had no idea why they wanted me dead. But what he did say was that the man who hired him seemed to have a very intimate knowledge of my work schedule along with where I parked my car. And this is how we came to learn that it was probably one of my coworkers that had paid him for my death. But despite everyone in my department being questioned, as well as company executives, no arrests were made and no definitive evidence was ever found. Now, I wasn't surprised. The prognosis had been bleak from the beginning. If someone knew how to hire a hitman on that dark web, even if it was an incompetent one, they most likely had the wherewithal to delete any evidence of the exchange from their computers. And this meant that even after their digital devices were analyzed, police were no closer to finding the person who tried to have me killed. Naturally, a huge part of me wanted to depart the company and find work elsewhere. I couldn't possibly work alongside anyone I suspected of wanting me dead, and that's what I told the executives. It was a bitter irony to find out that I'd secured a job that I didn't even want anymore. But in the end, I was made an offer I couldn't refuse. Now, I was offered an inflated salary, extra benefits, and I was promised the company parking lot would be reinforced and manned by security from then on. I was also offered a considerable one-time payment as well as legal aid from the company's lawyers to keep the story out of the media as the executives didn't want any bad press. Now, if I was a single man, I might have refused on principle. But since I was trying to start a family, it was my future wife that made the final decision, and if anything, staying at the company might help me root out the person who tried to have me killed. But I never did figure out who it was. None of the other candidates, including those in the final pool, displayed any observably strange or erratic behaviors in the immediate aftermath, leading some to theorize that the person who hired my potential killer was someone from outside the company who was intent on doing it harm. Now, this remains the most haunting mystery of my entire life, but not purely because I came so close to a violent death. It's because it serves as a reminder that man can do everything right, keep himself spiritually and morally pure, and he can still attract the kind of evil that's been spoken about since man first learned to speak. Hello, Joel. You can call me H. I grew up in London, and when I was a kid, I had a massive interest in computers. Now, my parents did all right for themselves career-wise, meaning that they had enough money to buy a PC when they still ran on Windows 95, and I used to go crazy on MS Paint or play the video games on the floppy disks my dad had brought home from work. And to me, that computer was nothing short of magic. And then as I got older, I got more and more interested in how they worked. And then in the year 2000, Dad signed us up for a Telewest dial-up internet connection, and that changed everything. I became a full-on computer nerd, and possibly at the perfect time to do so. The country was in the final stages of its IT revolution, and a degree in almost anything IT-related meant a ticket to the gravy train. Companies all over the country were practically letting IT graduates name their salaries. Because if you could run their networks and servers and allow them access to e-commerce, you'd make them hundreds of times whatever they spent on you. Now, I landed myself on one such job in 2008, and to say that I'd landed on my feet would be an understatement, but I earned my keep. I was very good at my job, but only because of how deeply it fascinated me, and long before 2008, I'd been reading about something which had passed from scientific theory to urban legend. You might know it as the deep web. Now, the deep web is a very different concept to the dark web, even though the two terms are kind of used interchangeably. The concept of the deep web has been around ever since the internet was invented, as in no different than the concept of public and private property. There's nothing inherently sinister about setting up some private website, but it was also inevitable that certain people would use it for illicit means, and frankly, it's amazing that it took until the late 2000s for that to finally happen. And that's when the term dark web was coined, to describe these sinister sites that traded in highly illegal merchandise and in some cases, even murder. And as you can imagine, the prospect fascinated me. And so off I went looking for them, and that's when I found the Silk Road. It was a fitting name, really, harking back to the 2nd century Pan-Asian trade route which brought spices and fine china to Europe. But this was anything but state-sanctioned. Set up by an American and launched in, I think it was 2011, the Silk Road didn't just sell drugs, it sold everything. But under that everything umbrella was a hell of a lot of drugs, guns, and other contraband like handheld hacking devices, banned media, or Asian-made sweets that were banned from US markets. Now you could count the list of rules on one hand, and almost everything functioned on an honor-based system, which turned my idea of drug dealing on its head. I'd always just assumed it was all about low purity, stepped-up products, and ripping people off at every turn. But the Silk Road was the polar opposite. It allowed wholesalers, and in some cases even manufacturers, to market their high-purity products at rock-bottom prices, mainly because they were cutting out the oh-so-expensive middlemen, and it was making people a hell of a lot of money. I visited the Silk Road every day for about 2 weeks before my curiosity evolved into something that I know now was greed, but at the time felt like opportunity. I made decent money, and I loved my job, but I was also lacking excitement in my life, and I was still young and stupid enough to really crave it. It also constituted a whole new system for me to obsess over, and by system, I mean the method by which drugs travel from their manufacturers to their consumers. I did enough research on shipping and pricing to ensure that I had at least a cursory knowledge of what I needed to do. And so one day in early 2012, I pulled the trigger on my little plan and ordered half a kilo of heroin for what amounted to 10 grand in cryptocurrency. Silk Road actually had seller reviews and a whole other seller reliability rating, and so I was easily able to find a highly rated heroin dealer who promised to hide my product in a small appliance of some kind before shipping it over. Part of me didn't really believe it would arrive, even though I knew the site was heavily policed in terms of fake reviews and scam sellers. And so when the package arrived, delivered by Royal Mail no less, my heart was thumping as I opened it up and disassembled what turned out to be a computer monitor. Now there it was, packed tightly in clear plastic baggies, half a kilo of pure golden brown Afghan heroin, enough to land me in prison from anywhere from 12 to 16 years. And after that, I had to find a buyer. And while you might assume that that was a relatively difficult process, it was not. I went into town on a Friday night, walked up to the first beggar I saw, and then told him that I'd give him a tenner if he showed me where to buy heroin. And that was all it took. He walked me to a phone, called a phone number after I handed him some change, and then about 15 minutes later, this teenage boy rode up on his bike and this beggar bought a bag of what he called brown from him. And that's when I stepped in and told the young lad on the bike that I wanted to talk to his boss. It was dark out, but I could still see the skeptical look that he gave me. But after a little exposition, he relented and asked for my phone number and then rode off saying that he'd pass it off to his boss. Not even 2 hours had elapsed before I got a call back and was making the half-hour walk to the dark, deserted street that I'd been told to wait on. And this is when I did something crucial and put on a ski mask. I made sure to keep myself out of sight, but that meant when a trio of what looked like hooded teenagers showed up, I almost scared the living daylights out of them when I'd stepped out to greet them. And once we'd confirmed that I was friendly, they told me to show them what I had, and since I had the good mind to bring a very small sample with me, I was only too willing to hand it over. They were still looking at me a bit funny since I was wearing the mask, but one of them, this poorly-looking lad who turned out to be older than the rest, dabbed a bit out onto his fist and then snorted it. I knew the product was pure, and therefore potent, but I wasn't ready for the effect it'd have on the user. It knocked him out on his feet. He couldn't talk, he couldn't keep his head raised, and he just sort of swayed on his feet while the other two boys just held back their laughter. Now they too seemed impressed with what I had, and then, after the old cliched question of, "You're not the police, are you?" they led me to the top floor of a block of flats to what you Americans would call the trap. And this is where I first met Steven. He made a really big deal out of the ski mask, aggressively at first, but then much more jovially as we got talking. He didn't like that I was wearing it, and then suddenly did like that I was wearing it. It made me a character, as he put it. There were more movie cliches when he and his boys had pat me down for a wire, and I was tempted to inform him that audio bugs were so small and reliable that I'd have one hidden in one of the buttons of my jacket, but I didn't. And after that, we got talking, and thanks to the sample, I didn't need to do much of it. The product spoke for itself thanks to the zombified junkie who had to be herded back to the flat. Stephen had a lot of questions, and I tried to answer as few of them as possible. I just simply told him that I had a lucrative business opportunity, and we could both get very rich off of it. And as you can imagine, this was music to his ears. He had his own bosses he needed to keep sweet, and the best way of doing that was making more money for them. And all he had to do was work with me, agree to my terms, and I'd get him the quality product that he needed to get an edge on the competition at a price he couldn't find anywhere else. That's how things started. And while things were a little bit shaky at first in terms of handoffs and keeping my identity a secret, I soon found a rhythm. I'd meet Stephen's couriers in varied but local locations, ensuring my face was covered in ways that preferably didn't attract attention. A scarf and sunglasses in the wintertime, for example, where I could just pull it up over my face nice and quickly. But whenever I met with Stephen face to not face, as it were, I wore the ski mask and sunglasses and never drove over in my car. Half kilos soon became kilos, but the most I ever sold at one time was 2 kilos. The most increasing variable after that was the frequency I would obtain packages. Because while the Silk Road was somewhat reliable, it wasn't foolproof. Not all poppy harvests yield the same quality product, so profit margins varied, and occasionally a trustworthy purveyor of quality goods would simply drop off the map for a while or nuke their account entirely. Delivering the packages to Stephen's couriers was also pretty nerve-wracking, and walking around with kilos of heroin on my person never got old. It was always terrifying. Always. But my God, did it make me a lot of money. I was paid in cash, bundles of it too, half of which I deposited in a very dodgy credit union run by 2 Bangladeshi blokes who took 10% for the privilege of washing my dosh, so to speak. Now the rest I spent on daily essentials, petrol, food shops, takeaways, stuff that doesn't raise any eyebrows when you pay with crisp 50-pound notes. And this went on for more than 2 years. Silk Road was shut down at one point, and its founder was arrested, but a replacement was set up in no time at all, so I was able to continue my dealings with Stephen after only the briefest of interruptions. But then came the day when I was almost caught, or at least that's what it felt like, because the package containing 2 kilos was just feet away from my front door when a police officer called at my flat to ask about a recent spate of burglaries. Now, it was still hidden away in its containers, the cavity of a rice cooker, so even if the officer came in and looked around, they wouldn't have suspected a thing. But paranoia is a hell of a drug, and that marked the first time that I began to consider giving it all up. I'd made a mind-boggling amount of money for such a small amount of overall work. Not quite £1 million, but close enough to feel like it. And once I had everything washed, I had enough to buy a house, enough to fritter away, and enough to squirrel away for the inevitable rainy days. And so I decided to quit while I was ahead. Now, I sold a few more packages to Stephen, even to put together some money to celebrate with once I'd made a clean break from the business. And then one day, I gave him a call to let him know that I was getting out. And I suppose it shows how utterly naive I still was that I thought that he'd be happy for me. We weren't friends, but we were fairly close. You can't not be if you're making so much money together. I think he wouldn't be over the moon about losing such a valuable asset, but I didn't think he'd get angry, and I certainly didn't think that he'd start threatening me. It turns out he did both. I called him, told him I was getting out, and at first, I could tell that he was nonplussed because of how quiet he went. Stephen was a talker, probably not the most ideal trait in a drug dealer, but that was just his way. So as I explained my plan to get out, and I didn't hear so much as a or an okay, I knew that he wasn't taking it well. But things got so much worse. Stephen was not accepting my resignation, and in a strange parody of a legitimate business, insisted I work a notice period before finally departing. Now I offered to teach him about crypto and how to use the Silk Road, but Stephen was having none of it. He told me he had no obligations to people and that he couldn't downsize without first getting the right liquidity. Stephen would often incorrectly use business terms that he didn't understand, but his point was clear. Without me, he wouldn't make as much money, and he didn't fancy that one bit. Now, before long, Stephen was straight up threatening me. Myself, my family, my friends, anything that sprang to mind. But if there's one thing that I stayed consistent with, it was keeping my identity a secret to the point that my only identifying features were the clothes that I wore to meetings, which were outfits that I never wore anywhere else, and my voice. So unless Stephen had some piece of miracle technology which would hunt me down using the sound of my voice alone, he wouldn't know where to find me. And so with that in mind, I did what very few people have done throughout history, and I hung up on an angry gangster. I'm not going to pretend that I was Mr. Cool about it. It made for a terrifying experience, and once my nerves had settled and I could think clear and straight again, I realized that I had absolutely nothing to be afraid of. Me and Stephen didn't mix in the same circles, we didn't live in the same areas of the city, and I'd never seen him during daylight hours either, so I'm pretty sure that we even kept different sleep schedules. I wasn't worried about bumping into him or any of his other little cronies anywhere, and even if I did, all I had to do was keep my mouth shut and they wouldn't realize it was me. As far as I knew, I'd gotten away with illegally making hundreds of thousands of pounds completely scot-free. And bloody hell, did that feel good. After 6 months or so of lying low and not spending too much, in which time the Silk Road got shut down for good, I decided to make my very first luxury purchase from a Bentley dealership. It was a used Bentley, so considerably less expensive than a brand new one, but Bentley's pre-owned program is probably the best on the market, so you end up with a car that is as next to brand new as it's possible to get. I visited the dealership once or twice before, mostly just driving past to admire the display models. But once I was in the clear money-wise, I started talking to the salespeople to get an idea of pricing and availability. It took a couple of visits to nail down the model I wanted. The salesman saw a chance to flog something a bit more expensive to someone young and flashy, but I was after something a little more discreet. Those sorts of models tended not to be entered into the pre-owned system, so I had to wait about 6 weeks before one became available. But when one did, I zoomed over to the dealership and put down the deposit that secured the car as mine. It felt like a victory parade, and I was happy as a pig in crap as I sat with the salesman signing papers and swapping cheerful banter. The whole process lasted about 45 minutes, and in that time, the dealership was visited by 2 men who wandered around the display models and then spoke with a saleswoman. I didn't pay any attention to them. I was far too focused on feeling smug and ogling the pictures of my refurbished Bentley. And then when the final papers were signed and I was given a date to pick up the car, I shook the salesman's hand, thanked him for all his time, and then rose from my chair and headed for the showroom's exit. But as I did, I noticed one of the 2 men looking at me. But not just looking, staring while standing statue still about 10 feet away. Maybe it's having grown up in London, but I didn't immediately return the man's stare. I just thought, what the hell are you looking at, while trying not to provoke a confrontation. That might sound a bit extreme to some of you, but as I said, London might be one of the oldest cities in the world, but it's not the friendliest. That meant that it wasn't until I was within feet of the door that I shot the man a look, and when I did, my blood turned to ice. It was not some random toff stopping in to buy a brand new Bentley. In fact, it was the one person in the world that I didn't want it to be. It was Stephen. He was wearing a suit and tie, which is partly why he didn't grab my attention when I saw him in my peripheral vision, and he was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. Now, I was right about to say something like, "Can I help you?" but I cut myself off and tried my very best to keep a neutral look on my face as I turned it away from him. But no sooner had I done that, he asked me, "Do I know you?" Stephen had been listening to me speak to the salesman for about 15 to 20 minutes, so I'm amazed that he hadn't had the realization earlier. But I knew what a precarious position I was in there, so I just stared back at him and simply shook my head before continuing on my way. My heart felt like it was trying to burst out of my chest by the time I was out the doors, and I had to summon every ounce of bravery I had not to sprint to my car and drive off doing 100. But as I started my engine and drove out of the dealership, I saw Stephen standing just outside the doors with his phone in his hand, quite clearly taking pictures or video as I was driving off. And as I drove, it felt like my heart was going into palpitations or I was having a panic attack or something. My vision started getting very gray around the edges, and I was taking shallower and shallower breaths. As much as I was scared I might crash my car, I knew I couldn't stop because Stephen might just be a few cars behind me. I didn't drive home. I was going to, but then realized how stupid that was given what had just happened, and turned to drive in the opposite direction. I ended up clocking maybe 5 or 6 miles before I turned into the car park of an apartment building and turned off my engine. That was the first real chance I had to stop and think, which felt like a relief at first because at least I wasn't going to lose concentration and crash my car. But it turned out to be anything but, because stopping only allowed the crushing reality of the situation to set in. Stephen had recognized me. There was no doubt about that. Enough that he wanted a record of my number plate so he could no doubt follow up on a strongly held suspicion. And when he did, when the man who'd vowed to kill me finally found me, he'd probably do things that'd make me want to die before he eventually ended me entirely. And as I contemplated that, the hazy vision panic returned and I found myself struggling to breathe. It took a minute, but I managed to calm myself enough that I could think straight, and then as I did so, the solution came to me clear as day, but it was an unthinkable one. The first part, and possibly the easiest, was abandoning my car in that car park, and the next was calling my girlfriend to tell her that she had to go and stay with her mom. She could tell something was wrong just from the sound of my voice, and I promised I'd explain everything face to face as soon as I could. But in the meantime, she had to leave the flat that we shared as quickly as possible and never return to it. Now, it took me hours to walk home, so I had plenty of time to try and reason with her, but in the end, she did as I asked. Then, when I myself got home, I packed up all the essentials, including the bricks of cash that I kept hidden away, and then took a taxi to a friend's house and asked if I could stay with him for a few days. I ended up borrowing his car to drive over to my girlfriend's mom's place, and after sitting her down in private in an upstairs bedroom, I told her everything. She had no idea that I'd been trafficking heroin. She thought that I was repairing all the appliances that I was being sent and then returning them to their owners. My excuse for the Bentley was that I'd been saving it for since I was 16, and since I had an okay salary and was good with money, she bought the excuse without asking any questions. I had this naive idea that she'd stay with me and accept my invitation to move to another city with me, but she didn't. In fact, she broke up with me there and then and said that she never wanted to hear from me ever again. Dealing drugs was one thing, but putting us in danger was another, and if it was only a matter of time before they found me through my car's registration, then she said I needed to leave right that instant. And that was the last time me and her spoke. Then the next day, after buying my mate's car from him for an eye-watering amount of cash, I drove up north, never to return to London. It broke my heart to do it. My parents didn't understand why I was leaving, and since I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, I made up a lie about finding a better job in the Northwest. They don't question why I never come to visit, and I'm always insisting that they come to visit me, but I think they suspect something by now. Maybe one day I'll tell them about the stupid, arrogant mistake I made and how it was that which destroyed my relationships and forced me into exile. I ended up selling that Bentley too, by the way, and I had it delivered to Manchester, and it was somewhat of a comfort at first, but it quickly became an enduring reminder of my own greed, as well as the pure devastation that the deep web had caused. Okay, so the TLDR of this is don't F around with the deep web. So even if you don't read this whole thing, take that lesson to heart for the love of God. So I used to screw around with cryptocurrencies in a very big way actually, but I won't bore you with all the nerdy little details. Just know that I was 4 digits into it and always looking for a chance to grow my pot. And so one of the major places for crypto dudes to congregate was the deep web. And this is mostly because they believe the surface web was heavily monitored, which I guess it is, obviously. But it's here that I was introduced to someone named Andre by a mutual friend. Andre said that he ran a crypto investment fund out of Belarus, and that if I made an investment, I could get double, maybe even triple the returns in just a matter of months. Now, the friend who introduced us said that Andre was legit, and so after a few weeks of talking back and forth to see if I could trust the guy, I transferred him the same amount in Bitcoin that my buddy did and then waited to see what he could do with it. Well, as it turned out, Andre could do a lot with it. And week after week, he showed me how the amount in my little pot was growing, and at first it started off slow, but as time went on, that relatively small number got bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it got to the point where I didn't want to risk losing such a large amount of crypto. It wasn't exactly some life-changing amount, but withdrawing then meant that I had literally 10 times more money than when I first started. But when I reached out to Andre and asked him how I would go about doing that, he made it very clear that it'd be a very foolish thing to back out then. And he told me not to lose my nerve, and that within a few months my pot could be worth tens of thousands of dollars instead of just a few thousand. I wanted more money, that goes without saying, but at the same time, I knew the longer that he was out there, the bigger the risk of losing it. And so I told Andre that, respectfully, that I'd like to withdraw what I'd earned. Now, he couldn't exactly stop me, but he was incredibly insistent. Not quite to the point of intimidation, but that was just around the corner, it seems. He didn't actually turn on me until I tried to withdraw the amount, at which point I only got back the amount that I initially invested, even though my wallet with Andre now said 0. And that's when I realized that the whole thing was a scam, and how whatever was going on, I certainly wasn't making any money from it personally. Now, I tried complaining to my friend about it, the one who'd put me in touch with Andre, but then he turned on me too. I tried warning him that Andre wasn't what he'd seemed, but my friend wouldn't listen. He told me that I made a big mistake in withdrawing my crypto because I put the whole system in jeopardy for everyone else. Now, it still wasn't too late to reinvest, in which case there would be no harm, no foul, but not doing so would leave everyone hanging dry, himself included. And that's when I realized that my friend, emphasis on the quotation marks there, must have been in on it, because nothing I said to him seemed to make a single bit of difference. All that mattered to him was getting me to reinvest by any means necessary, including threats. He told me Andre and his friends were not people I wanted to mess with, but since I was pretty adept at online security, I didn't think that they'd be able to find me. Now, I think on their own that they wouldn't be able to, but since I strongly suspect it was my so-called friend who betrayed my IP address to them, it was easy. Now, it started when they did something to my computer. Something that made it freeze up before an Internet Explorer window opened and some kind of program downloaded and installed itself as I'm screaming no, 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 no over and over. Now, I tried saving my PC by pulling all the wires out of the back, and I even double-checked that my VPN had been properly functioning at the time of the attack. I thought I'd disconnected it just in time, but just a few days later, weird things started happening around my apartment building. I first noticed when I came home that the window nearest my fire escape was open. It didn't look like anyone had been inside my apartment, but I very clearly remember closing the window before I left my apartment that morning. And that was enough to have me looking for someplace else to stay, at least until things blew over. But literally the same night that I went and backed up all my essentials, someone stole my car and I woke up to a note in my mailbox that just said, "Reinvest." Now, I went to stay with my mom that very same day, and over the next couple of days I reported my car stolen and canceled the month-to-month lease on my apartment. It was devastating because I had to basically trash all my devices on the assumption that they were compromised, and it took me years before I was able to fully replace everything. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the day my lease ended, I returned to my apartment to pick up the rest of my things. But when I did, something was waiting for me. I was walking towards my mom's car with a bag of clothes under each arm when a car started to turn down the lot and speeded towards me as it passed. It ended up crashing into the car that I took cover behind, and as it drove off, my mom started to freak the hell out of having to almost watch her boy get smushed. Only then did I come clean on what had happened to me, and you can call me a mama's boy if you want, but seeing her go full bear mama after I had told her was kinda cool. and she sent me to live with my uncle out of state for a while, and she got my dad to teach her how to shoot his gun just in case someone came around in my dad's house looking for me. She made a difficult time a lot easier, and she even offered me a few $100s to get myself a new laptop and a new phone. And I paid her back once I got access to my crypto and cashed it out, but I really appreciated what she and my uncle did for me at a time when I honestly thought that I might end up getting murdered over some damn crypto scheme. I don't even know how it all worked either. Like, I think Andre was using our money to make it look like he had this big investment network, which attracted people in the same way a Ponzi scheme does, but I don't know for certain. All I know is that whoever he was, he must have been working with some serious people if they were able to hunt me down, and willingly.